Some women have it all: beauty, brains, ambition, and the perfect relationship.
She was wildly in love and would do really anything to make him happy.
He let me know several times, she's a good girl, she's a good girl.
But after years of playing by the rules, love has a way of bending even the strongest convictions.
They knew it was gunshots. And then they thought they saw a man down in the middle of the street.
She called me screaming, "He's dead, they killed him, they killed him."
Once a good girl goes bad, they can pay the ultimate price.
People get so deep in that they can't pull themselves out.
She just took a bad turn by meeting a guy, and I feel like they played the game and they lost.
March 27th, 2017, Warren, Michigan. Located just north of Detroit, Warren offers a blend of suburban charm and urban convenience.
It's the third largest city in Michigan. It is a softer kind of area outside of Detroit where there's not as much of a hustle and a bustle.
Warren is pretty quiet, pretty family-oriented area. I mean, nice restaurants and different things like that.
But on this cool spring evening, an extraordinary 911 call spurs local police into action.
At 9:45 p.m., police get a call from Marcus Samuel. Marcus is blocks away from his house when he makes this call.
911.
Yes, that was happening is I got campers in my house, right?
You got what at your house?
I got campers. So I leave a young lady in my house, which I've been doing for a while. And I'm watching her on camera. She's talking to somebody on the phone, and she's telling them that I'm on the way back and that they can walk me up in the house. So they plan on robbing me.
Marcus tells dispatch that just moments before, he was hanging out at his home with his girlfriend, Brittany.
So 9:45, he tells this Brittany that he's gonna go down to the local party store, which is about a quarter of a mile down the street, and just gonna go grab something to drink. He just referred to her as Brittany. He could not remember her last name.
While there, Marcus says he decided to check his security camera at his house from his cell phone.
He's able to see what she's doing in the house with his camera, and she's making some phone call to someone. He has audio, and he's listening in, and he hears that he's being set up for a robbery. And she's definitely on the phone with some other person.
Police tell Marcus not to go home, but to meet them in a parking lot.
What kind of car are you gonna be in?
Black, sir.
You're gonna be waiting outside?
Yeah, I'm actually like down the block.
All right. Okay. Just wait right there while someone come and talk to you.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right, bye.
When officers arrive to the parking lot, there's no vehicle and they don't see Marcus anywhere.
So at that point, they called dispatch back and just wondering where he was. And dispatch is like, well, we told him to stay put.
Suddenly, 911 calls flood into the call center. There was a shooting just blocks away from this parking lot where they were waiting.
911, what is this regarding?
There's a dead body laying on. There was a bunch of gunshots. Came out.
I got a call, sir. Said a bunch of shots and a dead body. You said, where's the body, sir?
It's laying out in the middle of the road.
Do they need an ambulance?
The guy's dead.
Officers race to the address. They see a black car in the driveway, matching the description that Marcus gave them.
The officers find a man laying in the street. There's blood all around him.
They check to see if he is breathing, and he's not. So at that point, they immediately do CPR on him. And obviously the fire department's already been called and already en route.
Neighbors cautiously emerge from their homes.
Neighbors tell police the man lying in the street is Marcus Samuel.
"38-year-old Marcus Samuel was raised in Michigan with his big brother.
We grew up in Inkster as well as Detroit. Growing up, we had a good childhood, beautiful childhood. We are 11 months apart. We were very close. We played football, baseball, you name it.
From an early age, Marcus had a vivacious spirit and a great sense of humor.
He was very, very, very silly. He was, I don't want to say the class clown, but he was the class clown.
Mark was a comedian by nature. So, I mean, you're walking in the door to a joke. The joke might be about you, but there's a joke coming as soon as you walk in.
Marcus also had a talent for art and drawing. But once he reached high school, he fell into the wrong crowd and changed the direction of his life.
We in high school, we go to the same school. Man, I remember when Mark went away to prison. Mark left 10th, 11th grade. I went to school every day. Now he's gone. And that was big for the family.
Marcus served 10 years for manslaughter, passing the time doing tattoos on inmates. Upon his release from prison, he was a changed man.
After Mark got out of prison, Mark didn't engage in illegal activities. The perception was Mark was this big bad guy. Mark was an extremely in shape, buff, weightlifting softy. You know, he had a really soft heart.
Looking for a new path in life, Marcus decided to turn his tattooing into a career.
He saw a vision. He saw to a point where he knew how to draw. And he said that he feels like he should be doing tattoos.
So I bought Mark a tattoo gun. From then on, Mark would do tattoos, $20 tattoos in the basement. He would come to your house. He would book parties, tattoo parties, and the more he did it, he got better. So that's how his business grew. Then he opened a little shop, then he opened a big shop. He went from no employees to 4 or 5 employees. And Mark built his dream from the ground.
In the beginning, when he told me the name Penitentiary Tattoos, at first it's like, okay. But he was very proud of the studio. Very, very proud.
Through the years, Penitentiary Tattoos turned into a great success for Marcus and a positive resource for the community.
That tattoo shop, people could come and get a tattoo, a piercing, a laugh, a t-shirt, a hug, help with something that you needed, a job.
It was the place where everyone came to visit. A lot of local celebrities, rappers, you name it.
During this time, Marcus met his future wife and soon became the father of 2 beloved daughters.
And those little girls were his heart and lungs. It was anywhere he went, they went.
Marcus was a phenomenal father. That was his pride and joy. He was trying to do everything he can to leave a legacy for them.
Unfortunately, by 2017, his marriage was on the rocks. The 2 divorced but stayed friends. Marcus found himself newly single and had some catching up to do.
Dating was inconsistent. Like, I would probably never see anybody twice. I could see a girl, he might introduce her as, yeah, this is the love of my life right here, and you know, that's my baby, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, this Tuesday, Saturday, I'm like, well, girlie.
I told him to slow down with the dating of the women, though. I definitely told him that, because he was a hot commodity. He was definitely that.
But now, just moments after telling the 911 operator that his girlfriend Brittany was setting him up to be robbed, Marcus is lying motionless in the street.
He ended up getting shot 3 times. 2 were into the neck and head area.
EMS tries to save him, but he succumbs to his injuries.
Marcus is pronounced dead at 10:15 p.m.
We had detectives on that scene within 5 minutes. So what happened was, it was actually in front of his house, but it was across the street. Upon investigating the scene, we did recover 4 .40 caliber shell casings around the body.
There's no sign of the gun, but detectives note a watch, cell phone, necklace, and wallet containing almost $700 are still on Marcus's body. His car is also parked in his driveway, with the driver's side door wide open.
So it looks like he got out of his car and had an altercation in the roadway. Probably a good 20 feet from his vehicle. There's a possibility of an ambush, but we had no facts that would back that up.
Based off of what Marcus told the 911 dispatcher and the evidence at the scene, investigators believe it was a botched robbery.
When more police officers arrived, more and more people came out to see what was going on. I spoke to some of the witnesses. We only knew that one name, and that name was Brittany. That's the only thing we had a lead on, and nobody knew who this Brittany was.
Most neighbors tell detectives that they heard the gunshots, but no one seems to have seen anything, except one.
She described what she heard was squealing tires, and then looked out and saw a silver car go southbound on Marcus's street briefly and then make a right turn and actually slow down to pick up a person. She described him as a very thin male, African-American, between 5'8" and 5'10". That's all she could describe with him. It was dark, poorly lit street, and she also could hear a female yelling, who was the driver.
She says, get in, before the car peels off.
Could this be Marcus's mystery girlfriend?
We needed to get this Brittany, figure out who this Brittany was.
On March 27, 2017, Warren, Michigan police are investigating the shooting death of 38-year-old tattoo shop owner Marcus Samuel, who had just called 911 to report his new girlfriend, Brittany, was planning to rob him.
For us, it appeared to be a robbery gone wrong from the start.
Investigators are looking for this Brittany and a yet-to-be-ID'd black male in a silver car. Based off of Marcus's 911 call, he was watching video of Brittany in his home from his security cameras on his cell phone.
Police want to watch Marcus's security cameras, but the access is locked on his phone.
So we didn't have access to him right away.
Police file a subpoena for Marcus's phone while they reach out to his family, who have already heard the heartbreaking news through social media.
It was unbelievable. Initially, it was, that's not Mark. That's not Mark. Mark was Superman in my eyes. Like, you couldn't beat him up, you couldn't hurt him, you couldn't scare him. How could somebody shoot Mark? Like, how could somebody kill Mark?
One of my members called me screaming, Pastor, he's dead, they killed him. It just knocked me off my rock. I couldn't believe it.
As word about Marcus's death spreads like wildfire, family and friends share with police what they know about his new love interest.
We know that this Brittany's involved. I spoke to some friends of Marcus's. We find out that he does have a girlfriend of 2 weeks.
Marcus had just met Brittany while getting a tattoo at his shop.
He didn't disclose that relationship to many. He kind of kept it a secret, so many people did not know who that was.
No one knows Brittany's last name, but detectives learn that Marcus didn't hide his good fortune.
He would flaunt his wealth. He wanted to make sure people knew that he had a lot of money. He showed off his car, his Rolex watch.
He was very generous. He would fill up your grocery cart if you saw him in the grocery store. If he saw you at the gas pump, he would pay for your gas. He would pay for your meal and your family's meal. Very generous.
Mark was public with everything. He would make a post, today I officially have $1 million in the bank. Everybody see that. You right here in the middle of the hood.
That scared me. I said, hey, listen, stop flashing that money.
Obviously, that makes you a prime target for being robbed.
By the following morning, Marcus's brother Ronnie has arrived in Michigan after hearing the news.
One of our detectives talked to Marcus's brother Ron Jr., and Ron had told us that there was a wedding coming up.
Marcus was supposed to be the best man in his wedding.
When detectives ask Ronnie if he knew a woman named Brittany, he says he knows the name. Marcus had asked if he could bring a +1 to his wedding.
He said, I have a young lady, she's nice, she's a beautiful girl. She would be perfect to come to the wedding, to be by his side as a +1. And he was excited to bring her to the wedding. And he texted me her name. Her name was Brittany Fulwiley.
Michigan resident Brittany Lee Fulwiley was known for her good looks and bubbly personality.
She was pretty. A lot of men would see her and think how attractive she was. She had a nice complexion, nice hair, kept herself up. So she was, a pretty lady.
She's probably been told she's pretty her whole life, and people like her. She has a great personality.
With her effortless charm, dating came easy to Brittany. Then, at 21 years old, she had a son, and her priorities changed.
She had kind of like a split custody with the father. She loved her son. She always talked about her son. She definitely would try to do as much and spend as much time and, try to take him to different places to entertain her son when she had him.
To help support her son, Brittany was hired at a law firm in Southfield, Michigan.
She kind of took the job because she needed it, and she got the opportunity to come in and work for the firm.
The attractive 23-year-old quickly made friends there.
We both worked there. She was closer to my age, so we had kind of built a rapport with each other, going to lunch, hanging out, talking, about life and things like that. That's how we became friends at work.
Then, in March 2017, Brittany met Marcus Samuel.
She met him by getting a tattoo. He was a tattoo artist, and she had a lot of tattoos, so she went to him for some of her tattoos as well. I remember her mentioning that to me, and she was like, he always asked me to take me out on dates. And that's all she really said. She's like, yeah, this guy, he really likes me.
She's young, she's pretty, she's getting her life together, and this is how she started dating Marcus Samuel.
Even though the relationship was new, Brittany was excited for what lay ahead.
This is a young lady that had a bright future ahead of her. Working at a good law firm, had a potential to better herself, her life for her and her child.
Now, Brittany's name is connected to the attempted robbery and murder of her new boyfriend, Marcus Samuel. When investigators search her name through their database, they find no criminal record, but they do get a few leads to follow.
What we knew about Brittany at that time was that she was a 23-year-old female. We didn't have much background on her, other than we had several addresses. We used our resources to try to track her down.
Detectives spread out and get a huge break in the case.
She was able to tell us that she had seen Brittany. There's so many different avenues that we took. An ex-girlfriend, an ex-wife. Maybe he's got a problem with somebody at the tattoo parlor. There's so many different angles. But we knew from what he had told us before he was murdered that it was a robbery gone bad, and that's what it was. So we can narrow it down because he told our dispatch. That was huge for us. It all went back to that call, and we went through that call quite a few times just to get clues on. He was describing everything to a T. We knew that that was the right direction.
Detectives in the Detroit suburb of Warren are looking for 23-year-old Brittany Fulwiley, who has emerged as a person of interest in the murder of Marcus Samuel.
Hours into the investigation, police still have not located Marcus's new girlfriend, Brittany Fulwiley. While detectives continue to search for Brittany, they're left wondering who was the man running away from the scene.
He was described as a thin-build, African-American male.
After getting her full name, detectives find several addresses associated with Brittany Fulwiley. They also find her cell phone number.
Investigators file a warrant to track her cell phone records in an effort to find her.
While they wait on the records, detectives hit the pavement.
We had several addresses that we checked. We had leads to try to track her down. We went to a house in Detroit. It was her mom's house. We weren't sure that she lived there, and I actually spoke to her mom's roommate, and she said, well, she's at work.
Detectives eventually speak with her mother, and she gives them a huge piece of the puzzle.
She was able to tell us on the night of March 27th that she had seen Brittany.
Apparently, just 30 to 45 minutes after the murder, Brittany was at her mother's house, and she wasn't alone.
She gave us a time, I believe, of 10:45, 11 o'clock, that she had seen Brittany. And then another, who she referred to as Don. She referred to him as Eastside Don, and she did not know his last name. So at this point, we are letting other detectives know we're gonna need some more help. Start doing whatever you have to do to figure out who this Don is.
Then, less than 24 hours after the murder, police get a call from a man named Marquise Copeland, who has a very interesting story to tell.
I found about the murder of Marcus Samuel on social media. So the way that it went, I contacted the Warren Police Department. I told them that I had worked with Brittany.
She worked at a law firm in Southfield in the billing department. We heard about Marquise Copeland as a coworker and that he had important information concerning the case.
They came to my office and interviewed me. We met in a conference room.
Detectives ask Marquise if he knows anything about an East Side Don. He says he's not sure, but he knows Brittany has a boyfriend named Donald that she met on social media.
There was a long-term relationship between the two.
They had been dating for about a year or so, and they were living together.
He says Brittany seemed to be madly in love with Donald.
Brittany would go out of her way to make Donald happy. She would make sure that he had lunch or food. She would make sure he had it before sometimes she would.
She's totally enamored with her boyfriend. Marquise tells police that Brittany would even give him her whole paycheck if he needed it.
She did say he worked odd jobs, but we got paid weekly, so when she got paid, she wanted to get him the new Jordan shoes and the new this and the new outfits. So she kind of worked hard and took a lot of her money for that to make sure that she was satisfying him. It seemed like she was trying to, basically make him happy.
She even marked herself as his girl.
She had tattoos of him on her body. She had a couple tattoos of his name on her forearm, on her lower back, with his name, Donald, tattooed on her.
Over time, though, Marquise says he learned Brittany's boyfriend had a checkered past.
He was in jail for a gun charge, so he already had a previous felony record.
Then Marquise drops a bomb. He says a few months earlier, he and Brittany were at lunch when she raised a new subject.
I'm like, why would you even tell me something like that,
We thought that was actually shocking to hear her talking like that. And we thought, wow, it was actually key evidence for us.
March 28th, 2017, Warren, Michigan. Less than 24 hours after Marcus Samuel's murder, Warren police are speaking to Brittany Fulwiley's co-worker, Marquise Copeland, when he tells them something shocking.
So we went to lunch and she's like, well, my boyfriend told me, let's get this money. And I'm like, oh, what does that mean? Are you opening up a business? What are you guys about to get into, And she said, well, we're gonna start setting guys up. I'm pretty And he's like, guys will, take me different places and give me anything. So let's rob them. You go out with them. I'll come up with a weapon or something like that. And that's what the plan was.
She would attract men with her personality and looks, and he'd come out and rob them in a vulnerable moment.
So I kind of scrudged my face like, what? Are you serious, Brittany? And I'm like, Brittany, you're going to get hurt. I said, somebody's going to get hurt. By my reaction, she kind of like got alarmed, like, I'm just kidding. I would never do anything like that, Marquise. I'm like, why would you even tell me something like that,
Marquise says he believed his friend until the moment he heard the details of Marcus's murder on social media and put two and two together. He tells detectives that Brittany had told him about a tattoo guy that wanted to date her.
We talked about it and then 3 months later is when this incident occurred. So at first I didn't kind of put it together until I had to think about it like, wow, this is the guy she said that liked her.
Then one day, Brittany just stopped showing up at work. She didn't call in. She was just a no-show.
Nobody was able to get in touch with her. I texted her a few times like, hey, everything okay? She never responded. From what the description and everything that I knew, I kind of knew that it was Brittany.
We thought, wow, she had a child, 23 years old, no criminal history that I can recall. So we were shocked by that. It was actually key evidence for us. It gave us a lead for this Don, and we knew that Don was our guy.
Only Marquise says he doesn't know Don's last name. Before detectives can put a plan in motion to find this East Side Don, other evidence finally surfaces.
Detectives finally get access to Marcus's phone.
Our detectives obviously went through the phone. We do see images of Brittany, and then you could see Marcus. They're just sitting there in the family room. And then you see the point where he leaves and she's on the phone with somebody. So we can see the still shots of what he is listening to. And there are no still shots after the homicide. There was nobody in that house. That's what that told us, that she was not in the house at the time of the altercation.
Which means she was likely in the getaway car. They also see that Marcus made a call after calling 911.
Marcus called Brittany after the 911 call. That was his last call that he made to her. We didn't understand what he was thinking. He knew something was going bad, and then he decides to call her again. The question is, did she reassure him that everything was fine, just come on back?
Detectives now have enough to arrest Brittany Fulwiley for murder. They reach out to her mother for help.
We told Mom, hey, we're doing an investigation. We try to stay away the fact that she's a prime suspect, but we need to talk to Brittany. We had to be real careful with it because our key witness was her mother. It was my decision to make at that point. I said, well, let's do it. Let's have her try to get Brittany over. So we did. We had Mom call her, and Brittany did show up. And upon Brittany showing up, she was in that silver vehicle.
The same type of vehicle seen fleeing the shooting.
She was arrested on the spot. That actually went pretty smooth. So upon arresting her, she beat us to the punch when we went to get her cell phone. She was able to grab the cell phone and cradle it towards herself and lock us out.
Police take her in. But will she try and save herself and turn on her partner in crime?
A lot of times people get so deep in that they can't pull themselves out.
Just 24 hours after the murder of Marcus Samuel on March 28, 2017, police in Warren, Michigan have enough evidence to arrest 23-year-old Brittany Fulwiley. Police suspect Brittany conspired with her longtime boyfriend, Donald, to set up Marcus. But they still need his full name, and she refuses to give him up.
We attempted to get further information on Don, and she did not give up any information. She would not cooperate with us, no.
Brittany doesn't give Donald up because she has an attachment bond to him. When a young woman is in love and they have plotted and planned what they were going to do together, Brittany now feels like she is still in control, and if she doesn't give him up, then they both can be safe.
All we knew was Eastside Don at this point. After arresting Brittany, we get a search warrant to search her vehicle for evidence of the crime, which we do. We take the car back to our station and we do a search.
That search doesn't lead to a weapon, but they find paperwork that shows she had access to one.
We did find out that she had 2 weapons registered to her, being a .40 caliber and a 9mm. And obviously the .40 caliber was our concern due to the fact, obviously, that there was .40 caliber spent casings found at the scene.
They also find something else very important in the vehicle.
One of the key pieces of evidence that we do find are eviction papers from a residence in Detroit that have the names Brittany Fulwiley on there, along with Donald Robinson. We knew that this was the guy.
Now that they've confirmed his last name, investigators file a subpoena for Donald Robinson's phone records. Upon receiving those records, detectives see that Donald was who Brittany was talking to on the night of the murder, from 9:50 p.m. to 9:59 p.m.
We actually, at that point, had his phone number, so we had information that, based on the cell towers, that he was at that scene. And through the interview with Mom, we have them together half hour, 45 minutes after the murder. After gathering enough evidence on Donald Robinson, we have enough probable cause to make the arrest.
Brittany and Donald are both charged with first-degree premeditated murder, felony murder, and armed robbery.
We all were devastated. This is somebody you go to lunch with, you sit next to every day, you see 8 hours a day. So everybody was appalled, by the news.
It was very surprising. It was the last person I would think that would do something like this. He let me know several times, she's a good girl.
Once they're both in custody, detectives try to tie up some loose ends and search everywhere for the murder weapon.
We wrote numerous search warrants. We hit several houses. With Don Robinson, we hit 3 different residences all at once because we were looking for that .40 caliber gun. And the same with Brittany, we had to hit several houses with her.
Unfortunately, they come up empty.
To this day, we have not found the gun.
With Brittany and Donald unwilling to come clean, prosecutors prepare for trial. Will the couple fold on each other or stick it out till the end?
Young women at 23 years old, they're dealing with a lot of self-esteem issues, coming into themselves, trying to really get love. Some men are able to manipulate the situation and get what they need from them simply by love bombing, by making it apparent that they love them and they don't want them to leave. At that young age, you're not really sure of what love looks like. You may not have seen it.
23-year-old Brittany Fulwiley and her boyfriend Donald Robinson have both been charged with first-degree premeditated murder, felony murder, and armed robbery in the death of Marcus Samuel. In April of 2018, a little more than a year after Marcus's death, the couple stands trial together.
Brittany and Donald were trialed together. They had 2 separate attorneys, court-appointed attorneys, but they did everything together.
Prosecutors paint a picture of a woman in love, willing to do whatever it takes to prove herself to her man.
I think with the relationship she had with Donald, he would always tell her, oh, you think you're pretty, that everybody's supposed to bow down to you. So she really didn't like when people called her pretty. And she wanted to prove him different. Like, I may be pretty, but I can be a bad girl too. So I feel like that's what her motive was in the whole situation, to show him, I'm this ride or die for you.
They believe that's why when Donald suggested they use her looks to rob rich men, she was all for it.
She would do anything for the man that she loved, even use herself as bait in a dangerous plot. The scheme that they come up with is let's get fast money.
I feel like Brittany got persuaded by trying to satisfy Donald, by knowing that with her looks and guys that had, more than what Donald had, that she could get more financially and be able to take care of her and Donald.
And Marcus Samuel seemed like the perfect target. In the short time he and Brittany dated, prosecutors say Marcus fell under her spell.
He's really making plans to be with this young woman.
Then on the night of March 27th, 2017, when Marcus went to the store, Brittany and Donald decided to make their move. But they didn't realize that Marcus would catch on through his surveillance video and call 911.
They said, stand by, we have officers on the way. And he tried calling Brittany again. He must have trusted something that she said, and he walked right into an ambush. Something went terribly wrong in that street because he parks the car in the driveway. Proceeds to walk 20 feet, and there's an altercation. We speculate that Don, possibly just because of the size difference, had to use the gun or had the gun out on him.
Between the witnesses, phone records, and surveillance footage, prosecutors say the evidence against Brittany and Donald is overwhelming. Neither one takes the stand in their own defense.
They had no case. I sensed that he had no defense. The attorney, I thought, he did the best he could, but he had really nothing else other than find something that we made a mistake on. But we didn't.
On April 27th, the jury finds them both guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, felony murder, and armed robbery.
I knew these two had killed this man. They were definitely part of it. I'll never know who pulled the trigger, but I know they were responsible for his death.
Brittany's reaction in court was kind of numb. She kind of just looked straight ahead.
Brittany stuck by her man to the end. They are both sentenced to life in prison without parole.
I would describe that as justice 100%. Absolutely, yes. Donald was very remorseful. His eyes were red, very remorseful. Brittany, no remorse whatsoever. She was very upset, very angry.
Not enough. We'll take it. Justice was served, but life without parole is still, that don't replace what she did.
As the years have passed since Marcus's death, the thoughts of what was lost and what could have been linger.
Mark just did great things. He turned being a felon around to something positive, and he worked really hard to make his brand known worldwide. I miss my cousin every day.
To this day, I do forgive the individuals that was involved, Brittany and Donald. Of course, I forgive them, but it's hard to forget.
He was a great man. He was a great father, great brother, just great friend overall to anyone and everyone.
Brittany's story went from a young mother in love to a cautionary tale in a split-second decision.
When young girls decide that they want to do the walking on the wild side, when they would rather get fast money than work for it, when they change their ethics, when they decide that I want to do anything for my man, that's when it becomes deadly.
When you're young, a 9 to 5 can feel like an anchor pulling you down. It's that age when the world feels limitless. But when love clouds your judgment, regret can linger long after the rush is gone. And that love is nothing but a distant...
The air in Toronto on that bitter November morning in 1995 carried the unmistakable bite of an impending winter, a sharp, metallic chill that seemed to freeze time itself along the rain-slicked asphalt of the downtown commercial district. In the quiet hours before dawn, beneath the amber glow of sodium streetlights humming against a heavy, bruised sky, a silent drama unfolded inside a dimly lit corporate office building, a meticulously planned violent encounter that would shatter the peaceful facade of Canada's largest metropolis and baffle investigators for nearly 3 decades. 28-year-old corporate financial analyst Julian Vance was found slumped across his mahogany executive desk, his life abruptly and brutally extinguished by a single, execution-style gunshot wound to the back of the head. There was no sign of a forced entry, no frantic struggle or overturned furniture, and no obvious weapon left behind to tell the tale. The killer had moved through the high-security building like a phantom, bypassing electronic keycard logs and surveillance blind spots with a chilling familiarity that suggested not a random act of predatory violence, but a calculated, ice-cold execution born from the deepest shadows of personal betrayal. For the homicide detectives who rushed to the desolate crime scene that freezing morning, the initial hours offered an agonizing vacuum of tangible evidence. The downtown office tower was a fortress of glass, steel, and advanced electronic security, yet the digital audit trail revealed a maddening paradox. The security system had suffered a deliberate, localized power glitch precisely 42 minutes before the estimated time of death, neutralizing the closed-circuit cameras covering the executive suites. The only physical trace left behind by the perpetrator was a microscopic fragment of synthetic textile fiber snagged on the brass latch of the office window and a discarded, half-empty paper coffee cup resting carelessly on a side table near the entryway, an ordinary paper cup bearing the faded corporate logo of a local downtown cafe, now silent and seemingly devoid of any readable fingerprint due to the heavy condensation and the brisk morning air. As the investigation widened, detectives scoured Julian Vance's personal and professional life, uncovering a complex web of corporate espionage, bitter financial disputes, and tangled personal relationships. Colleagues described Julian as a brilliant, fiercely ambitious analyst who was on the verge of exposing a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme operating within a subsidiary shell company. Yet, beneath his polished exterior and promising career trajectory lay a labyrinth of family tensions, most notably involving his estranged older twin brother, Arthur Vance. Though identical in every biological aspect, sharing the exact same DNA profile, identical facial structures, and matching dental records, the brothers had lived drastically divergent lives for over a decade. While Julian inhabited the upper echelons of corporate finance in downtown Toronto, Arthur had drifted through a chaotic succession of transient jobs, accumulating massive gambling debts and a bitter, consuming resentment toward his brother's success. When detectives first brought Arthur Vance in for questioning during the initial weeks of the 1995 investigation, he appeared outwardly composed, offering an airtight alibi supported by receipts and witness statements placing him 300 miles away in Montreal at the exact hour of the murder. Because standard DNA profiling technology in 1995 could not differentiate between identical twins, and fingerprint analysis at the scene yielded no definitive matches outside of Julian's own workspace, law enforcement ran straight into an impenetrable biological and legal brick wall. Without a distinguishing genetic marker or an eyewitness who could pierce the veil of their identical faces, the investigation ground to an agonizing halt. The case file was officially shelved, relegated to the dusty archives of unsolved homicides, while the haunting mystery of Julian Vance's execution faded from the front-page headlines into the dark, restless slumber of a classic cold case. Yet, time does not erase truth. It merely buries it beneath layers of silence, waiting for the patient evolution of science to unearth what human eyes could no longer see. Fast forward nearly 30 years to the modern era of forensic genomics, where breakthroughs in touch DNA extraction, low copy number PCR amplification, and investigative genetic genealogy began breathing new life into forgotten case files. Cold case investigators in Toronto, partnering with advanced private DNA laboratories, pulled the original 1995 evidence box from the municipal vaults, setting their sights on the seemingly mundane paper coffee cup recovered from the crime scene near Julian Vance's office doorway. Using next-generation sequencing techniques and sophisticated microvariant analysis capable of detecting subtle epigenetic and somatic mutations unique to identical twins, mutations developed through decades of differing environmental exposures, lifestyle habits, and cellular division, forensic geneticists achieved the impossible. They successfully isolated a full, pristine touch DNA profile from the coffee cup's rim that conclusively separated Arthur Vance's genetic signature from his murdered brothers. Armed with this groundbreaking forensic breakthrough, federal and local task force units launched a covert, high-stakes surveillance operation to track Arthur Vance, now a weathered man in his late 50s living quietly under a radar of suburban obscurity in upstate New York. The objective was simple yet terrifyingly delicate: obtain a fresh, contemporaneous biological sample from Arthur without his knowledge to serve as an unassailable legal comparison in a court of law. For days, undercover operatives shadowed his every movement through commuter trains, grocery stores, and local coffee shops, waiting for the precise window of opportunity. That moment arrived on a brisk Tuesday morning at a bustling regional airport terminal, where Arthur stopped at a terminal kiosk, purchased a hot beverage, and absent-mindedly discarded his paper coffee cup into a public recycling bin before boarding a domestic flight. Within seconds of Arthur walking toward his departure gate, an undercover investigator retrieved the discarded cup from the bin, handling it with sterile precision and sealing it inside an airtight biological evidence pouch. Rushed via emergency courier to the State Forensic Laboratory, the DNA extracted from the rim of the airport coffee cup was subjected to immediate, rigorous comparative profiling against the touch DNA profile preserved from the 1995 crime scene evidence. The results flashed across the computer screen with terrifying, irrefutable clarity: a 100% biological match. The microscopic trace left behind on a paper cup in an airport terminal bridged a 29-year chasm of deception, shattering the identical twin immunity barrier once and for all, and sealing Arthur Vance's catastrophic fate. Within hours of the laboratory confirmation, tactical law enforcement units closed in, executing a synchronized arrest as Arthur stepped off his connecting flight. Stripped of his decades-old illusion of absolute safety, his face drained of color as the cold steel handcuffs locked around his wrists, marking the sudden, violent end of a nearly 3-decade evasion. Interrogated under relentless, unblinking lights in a sterile Toronto interrogation room, confronted with the undeniable microscopic proof of his presence at his brother's desk on that freezing November night in 1995, Arthur's icy composure finally fractured. In a choked, trembling whisper, he confessed to the cold-blooded execution, revealing how he had bypassed the corporate security system using stolen access codes, waited silently in the shadows of the executive suite, and gunned down his identical twin over a bitter dispute concerning financial ruin and consuming envy. The subsequent trial gripped the nation, dominating headlines and legal broadcasts as prosecutors laid bare the chilling mechanics of a fratricidal conspiracy executed behind the mask of identical biology. Legal experts hailed the verdict as a historic milestone in criminal jurisprudence, proving definitively that modern science can dismantle even the most sophisticated alibis and pierce the veil of twin genetics. Sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years, Arthur Vance was dispatched to a maximum security penitentiary, where he now spends his remaining days isolated in a concrete cell, a prisoner of the very time he thought he had successfully cheated. The ghost of Julian Vance, resting in peace beneath the Canadian soil, finally received the absolute justice denied to him for nearly 3 decades, leaving behind a haunting, eternal reminder that truth is a living force waiting patiently in the dark, ready to break through the silence whenever science, courage, and relentless dedication align. The air inside the downtown precinct's homicide bullpen felt thick, recycled, and suffocating as the clock ticked past midnight into the early hours of that freezing November morning in 1995, casting harsh shadows across desks piled high with cold coffee cups, crumpled case notes, and flickering cathode ray monitors. For Detective Marcus Thorne, a 20-year veteran of the Toronto Police Service whose eyes were etched with the permanent fatigue of a man who spent his life chasing ghosts, the crime scene photographs spread across his scarred wooden desk represented an unsolvable riddle wrapped in an impenetrable wall of corporate silence. The victim, 28-year-old corporate financial analyst Julian Vance, sat frozen in time on film, slumped forward across his expansive mahogany executive desk inside the 32nd floor office tower, a single, devastating entry wound at the base of his skull marking the precise point where his brilliant career and vibrant life had been instantly extinguished. There was no signs of a violent struggle, no shattered glass, no defensive wounds on the victim's hands, and no discarded cartridge casing left behind to give ballistic technicians a preliminary lead. The perpetrator had moved through the high-security commercial building with the chilling, ghost-like precision of someone who possessed intimate knowledge of every security blind spot, every electronic keycard log, and every operational protocol governing the skyscraper. Thorne leaned back in his squeaking leather chair, rubbing his tired temples as he re-examined the initial technical reports compiled by the crime scene unit. The downtown office tower was a fortress of modern engineering, protected by state-of-the-art electronic surveillance, biometric access turnstiles at the ground floor lobby, and private security patrols that monitored the premises 24 hours a day. Yet, the digital audit trail retrieved from the building's central mainframe revealed a maddening anomaly that immediately elevated the homicide from a standard robbery gone wrong to a meticulously orchestrated assassination. Precisely 42 minutes before the estimated time of death, the entire security grid governing the executive suite wing had suffered a localized, deliberate power interruption. It was not a random electrical failure caused by aging infrastructure or a weather surge. Someone had manually bypassed the auxiliary circuit breakers located in a maintenance sub-basement, neutralizing the closed-circuit television cameras and plunging the hallway into electronic darkness. As forensic technicians combed the executive suite inch by inch under blinding halogen lights, their yield of physical evidence was remarkably sparse, bordering on an eerie vacuum. The gleaming mahogany desk yielded no foreign fingerprints outside of Julian Vance's own routine impressions, and the pristine carpet fibers showed no tread patterns other than the victim's own loafers. However, near the heavy oak entryway leading out to the private corridor, investigators recovered two items that would ultimately become the twin anchors of the entire investigation: a microscopic fragment of synthetic textile fiber snagged on the brass latch of the office window, and a discarded, half-empty paper coffee cup resting carelessly on a side table. The paper cup, bearing the faded corporate logo of a local downtown cafe, sat innocently amidst the clinical opulence of the office. Condensation had formed along its outer cardboard wall, but the brisk morning air and the sterile environment had left the rim seemingly devoid of any immediately readable fingerprint or standard biological residue discernible by the rudimentary forensic standards of 1995. With the physical evidence offering a frustratingly narrow window into the killer's identity, Detective Thorne and his investigative team turned their focus toward unraveling Julian Vance's personal and professional life, entering a labyrinthine world of high-stakes corporate finance, hidden rivalries, and mounting tension. Interviews with colleagues and junior analysts at the firm painted a complex portrait of a rising star who was fiercely ambitious, mathematically brilliant, and utterly relentless in his pursuit of corporate transparency. In the weeks leading up to his murder, Julian had been spearheading an internal audit of a multi-million-dollar subsidiary shell company, an obscure financial entity suspected of funneling corporate capital through offshore accounts. According to confidential internal memos discovered on Julian's encrypted office computer, he was mere days away from presenting a devastating report to the executive board, a report that threatened to expose high-level embezzlement and trigger immediate federal indictments. Yet, as detectives dug deeper into Julian's background, peeling back the polished layers of his professional success, they uncovered a far more intimate and volatile source of friction that eclipsed corporate greed, a deeply fractured family dynamic. Julian was not an only child. He was the younger of identical twins, sharing an identical genetic blueprint, matching facial structures, and identical dental records with his estranged brother, Arthur Vance. While Julian had climbed the corporate ladder in downtown Toronto, carving out a life of affluence, stability, and social standing, Arthur's trajectory had traced a tragic, downward spiral. Over the preceding decade, Arthur had drifted through a chaotic succession of transient jobs, accumulating massive gambling debts, erratic behavioral patterns, and a bitter, consuming resentment toward his brother's steady ascent. Investigators learned that the twins had engaged in increasingly bitter confrontations over perceived slights, parental favoritism, and financial assistance, culminating in a violent argument just 2 months prior to the murder, where Arthur had reportedly threatened his brother's life in a crowded downtown restaurant. Armed with these explosive revelations, homicide detectives dispatched units to locate Arthur Vance and bring him into the precinct for a formal interrogation. When Arthur walked through the doors of the downtown station house, the psychological impact of his presence was immediate and unsettling. Stepping into the harsh fluorescent light of the interview room, his face was an exact mirror image of the dead man lying in the municipal morgue. Every facial contour, every structural line of the jaw, and every nuance of expression matched the victim with terrifying precision. Yet, throughout hours of intense, unblinking questioning by Detective Thorne, Arthur remained outwardly ice-cold and remarkably composed. He exhibited none of the nervous tics, defensive stuttering, or emotional volatility typical of suspects cornered by circumstantial suspicion. Instead, he calmly presented an airtight alibi, supported by hotel receipts, toll booth surveillance logs, and witness statements from a motel desk clerk in Montreal, placing him 300 miles away from Toronto at the exact hour Julian was executed. The realization that they were confronting a nearly impenetrable alibi backed by the identical biological mask of a twin brother drove the early investigation into an agonizing dead end. In 1995, forensic DNA profiling technology was still in its relative infancy, relying on multi-locus probe testing and restriction fragment length polymorphism methods that required substantial quantities of high molecular weight biological material. Crucially, standard DNA profiling protocols at the time possessed zero capability to differentiate between identical twins who share virtually identical nuclear DNA profiles. Furthermore, fingerprint analysis of the crime scene yielded no definitive matches outside of Julian's own workspace, and the paper coffee cup recovered near the entryway presented an insufficient cellular yield for the crude testing methods available to forensic labs of that era. Without a distinguishing genetic marker, an eyewitness who could pierce the veil of their identical faces, or a confession extracted under pressure, law enforcement ran straight into an insurmountable legal and biological brick wall. Frustrated by administrative constraints, shifting prosecutorial priorities, and the complete exhaustion of viable leads, the investigation gradually lost its momentum as months bled into years. The physical evidence boxes, including the synthetic fiber fragment and the cardboard coffee cup, were carefully sealed, labeled, and transferred from active detective bureaus to the municipal police department's dark, climate-controlled archive vaults, where unsolved homicide files awaited the slow, quiet erosion of time. For nearly 30 years, the murder of Julian Vance remained a haunting open wound in the collective memory of Toronto's legal and law enforcement community, a classic cold case defined by the agonizing paradox of a killer who possessed the victim's exact face, walking freely under the protective shadow of an identical genetic shield. Yet, history demonstrates that science does not stand still, and time, while often an ally to the guilty, is also the silent builder of technological redemption. As the calendar turned into the advanced decades of the 21st century, a quiet revolution in forensic genomics began to reshape the landscape of criminal investigations worldwide. Breakthroughs in touch DNA extraction, low copy number PCR amplification, and next-generation sequencing opened doors that previous generations of detectives could only dream of unlocking. Crucially, Forensic scientists developed sophisticated microvariant and epigenetic sequencing techniques capable of detecting subtle, somatic mutations unique to identical twins. Mutations acquired through decades of differing environmental exposures, distinct lifestyle habits, cellular replication errors, and microvariations in DNA methylation. Cold case units across North America began re-examining historic evidence lockers with renewed vigor, realizing that microscopic traces long dismissed as useless could now speak with undeniable clarity. In Toronto, a specialized cold case task force partnering with advanced private forensic laboratories pulled the original 1995 evidence box for the Julian Vance homicide out of storage, setting their sights squarely on the seemingly mundane paper coffee cup recovered from the crime scene near the office entryway. Recognizing that the cup had absorbed microscopic skin cells and salivary proteins shed by whoever handled it on that fateful morning, geneticists applied state-of-the-art laser-assisted cell sorting and high-sensitivity extraction protocols. Against all historical odds, the laboratory successfully isolated a full, pristine touch DNA profile from the cup's rim. When subjected to advanced comparative analysis, the profile bypassed standard limitations, revealing subtle genetic microvariations that conclusively isolated a unique signature distinct from Julian Vance's known baseline, a signature that matched the genetic profile of his estranged twin brother, Arthur Vance. Armed with this groundbreaking forensic breakthrough, federal and local task force units launched a covert, high-stakes surveillance operation to track Arthur Vance, who had spent the intervening decades living quietly under a radar of suburban obscurity in upstate New York. Now a weathered man in his late 50s, Arthur had maintained a low profile, occasionally moving between transient addresses and avoiding large-scale digital footprints. The tactical objective facing investigators was as delicate as it was critical. They needed to obtain a fresh, contemporaneous biological sample from Arthur without his knowledge, establishing an unassailable legal chain of custody for a comparative court presentation. For days, undercover operatives shadowed his daily routines, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of commuter trains, grocery store aisles, and local commercial districts, waiting patiently for the precise window of opportunity to present itself. That decisive moment arrived on a brisk Tuesday morning at a bustling regional airport terminal, where Arthur stopped at a terminal kiosk, purchased a hot beverage, and absent-mindedly discarded his paper coffee cup into a public recycling bin before proceeding toward his domestic flight departure gate. Within seconds of Arthur walking past the security threshold, an undercover investigator moved swiftly to the bin, retrieving the discarded cup with sterile precision and sealing it instantly inside an airtight biological evidence pouch. Rushed via emergency courier to the State Forensic Laboratory, the DNA extracted from the rim of the airport coffee cup was subjected to immediate, rigorous comparative profiling against the touch DNA profile preserved from the 1995 crime scene evidence. The results flashed across the high-resolution computer screen with terrifying, irrefutable clarity, a 100% biological match that bridged a 29-year chasm of deception, shattered the identical twin immunity barrier once and for all, and sealed Arthur Vance's catastrophic fate. Within hours of the laboratory confirmation, tactical law enforcement units closed in, executing a synchronized arrest as Arthur stepped off his connecting flight. Stripped of his decades-old illusion of absolute safety, his face drained of color as the cold steel handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists, marking the sudden, violent end of a nearly 3-decade evasion. Interrogated under relentless, unblinking lights in a sterile Toronto interrogation room, confronted with the undeniable microscopic proof of his presence at his brother's executive desk on that freezing November night in 1995, Arthur's icy composure finally fractured. In a choked, trembling whisper, he confessed to the cold-blooded execution, revealing how he had bypassed the corporate security system using stolen access codes, waited silently in the shadows of the executive suite, and gunned down his identical twin over a bitter dispute concerning financial ruin and consuming envy. The subsequent trial gripped the nation, dominating headlines and legal broadcasts as prosecutors laid bare the chilling mechanics of a fratricidal conspiracy executed behind the mask of identical biology. Legal experts hailed the verdict as a historic milestone in criminal jurisprudence, proving definitively that modern science can dismantle even the most sophisticated alibis and pierce the veil of twin genetics. Sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years, Arthur Vance was dispatched to a maximum security penitentiary, where he now spends his remaining days isolated in a concrete cell, a prisoner of the very time he thought he had successfully cheated. The ghost of Julian Vance, resting in peace beneath the Canadian soil, finally received the absolute justice denied to him for nearly 3 decades, leaving behind a haunting, eternal reminder that truth is a living force waiting patiently in the dark, ready to break through the silence whenever science, courage, and relentless dedication align. The fluorescent lights of the downtown homicide division hummed with a low, agonizing resonance as Detective Marcus Thorne stared fixedly at the sprawling caseboard, his mind looping endlessly through the perplexing timeline of the Julian Vance homicide. It was now late afternoon on that grim November day in 1995, and the relentless pulse of the city outside offered no answers, only a deafening wall of indifference. The physical dossier before him was deceptively thin, a handful of Polaroids depicting the silent, blood-spattered executive suite, a preliminary autopsy report confirming death by a single, catastrophic gunshot wound to the base of the skull, and a collection of digital logs that refused to make logical sense. How a killer had managed to slip past the high-tech biometric turnstiles, neutralize a localized security grid via the basement circuit breakers precisely 42 minutes prior to the murder, and vanish without leaving a single verifiable footprint remained an architectural masterpiece of criminal planning. Thorne traced his thumb across the cold metal edge of the desk, acutely aware that whoever walked into that 32nd floor office knew Julian Vance's habits, his schedule, and his vulnerabilities down to the microscopic detail. The investigation's initial canvas widened outward from the crime scene into the glittering, ruthless world of corporate finance, where Julian Vance had made both loyal allies and dangerous enemies. Detectives fanned out across Toronto's financial district, interviewing junior analysts, senior vice presidents, and board members who spoke in hushed, guarded tones about the dead man's relentless ambition. Julian had been assigned to audit a sprawling, multi-million-dollar subsidiary shell company, a shadowy corporate entity designed to siphon institutional liquidity into offshore accounts managed by unseen hands. According to confidential internal memos retrieved from his encrypted desktop computer, Julian was merely 48 hours away from presenting an unvarnished, devastating investigative report to the Federal Regulatory Commission. Investigators scrutinized the corporate hierarchy, turning over every stone, interviewing disgruntled executives whose careers hung in the balance, and subpoenaing financial records that spanned multiple international jurisdictions. Yet, every corporate lead ultimately dissolved into a bureaucratic maze of shell corporations, untraceable wire transfers, and corporate stonewalling, leaving the detective team with plenty of suspects driven by monetary desperation, but no direct physical link to the 32nd floor executive suite. Thorne knew instinctively that corporate greed, while a powerful motivator, lacked the chilling, visceral intimacy of the execution style that defined the murder. The killer had not sent a professional hitman from the underworld. The precision, the lack of forced entry, and the quiet execution pointed directly to someone who possessed a deeply personal vendetta against Julian Vance. That realization pulled the investigative spotlight away from boardrooms and banking towers, dragging it down into the dark, tangled web of the victim's personal life and family history. It was during this deep-dive background check that detectives first uncovered the existence of Arthur Vance, Julian's identical twin brother, whose existence had been carefully cordoned off from Julian's polished corporate persona. While Julian inhabited the pristine, sunlit world of high-end real estate, executive tailors, and downtown skyscrapers, Arthur's life had degenerated into a chaotic, volatile existence marked by severe gambling addictions, transient motel addresses, and a festering, all-consuming resentment toward his brother's steady ascent. Interviews with estranged family members and former acquaintances painted a disturbing portrait of sibling rivalry turned violently pathological. Witnesses recounted explosive arguments at family gatherings where Arthur had openly cursed his brother's success, bitterly complaining that Julian had stolen opportunities, parental favor, and biological superiority. Just 2 months prior to the murder, a violent altercation had erupted between the twins at a crowded downtown tavern, requiring security guards to physically separate Arthur after he hissed a chilling threat that he would tear down everything Julian built, piece by piece. Armed with this explosive motive, detectives immediately prioritized locating Arthur Vance, launching an intensive manhunt across the city's underground gambling dens, transient boarding houses, and low-rent motels. When Arthur was finally brought into the downtown precinct for questioning, the psychological impact of his presence sent a visible shudder through the homicide squad room. Walking under the harsh glare of the interrogation room lights, Arthur was not merely a suspect. He was an exact biological replica of the dead man lying in the municipal morgue. Every structural contour of the jaw, every nuance of facial symmetry, and the identical hazel hue of the eyes matched the victim with terrifying, mirror-image precision. Yet, during hours of relentless, unblinking interrogation led by Detective Thorne, Arthur Vance did not flinch, stutter, or betray a single micro-expression of guilt. He maintained an icy, unnerving composure, calmly fielding questions about his whereabouts with the practiced detachment of a seasoned actor. When pressed regarding the bitter arguments and the tavern threat, Arthur dismissed them as typical sibling friction, offering a smooth, rehearsed explanation that downplayed the deep-seated hatred festering beneath the surface. More importantly, when detectives confronted him with the timeline of the murder, Arthur produced an airtight, documented alibi. He presented hotel registration receipts, ATM transaction logs, and witness statements from a desk clerk at a modest motel in Montreal, placing him 300 miles away from Toronto at the exact hour Julian was executed. Thorne felt a wave of profound frustration as he realized that Arthur's alibi, backed by physical receipts and electronic timestamps, formed an impenetrable shield that local prosecutors could not legally pierce. The legal and biological realities of 1995 compounded the investigation's growing despair. In an era before touch DNA profiling, low copy number PCR amplification, or investigative genetic genealogy, law enforcement operated under an unyielding technical limitation. Standard DNA profiling techniques could not differentiate between identical twins. Because identical clones share the same nuclear DNA profile, conventional forensic laboratories could not prove whether biological material recovered from a crime scene belonged to the victim or his twin brother. Furthermore, the crime scene yielded no foreign fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no physical residue other than the mysterious paper coffee cup near the entryway, an item whose cellular yield was far too degraded for the crude testing methods of the mid-1990s. Law enforcement had run straight into an absolute biological and legal dead end. Without a distinguishing genetic marker or a signed confession, the state could neither arrest nor charge Arthur Vance, despite the heavy, suffocating cloud of circumstantial suspicion hanging over his head. As weeks bled into months, administrative pressure from police leadership and shifting prosecutorial priorities forced the active investigation to wind down, leaving the Julian Vance file in a state of suspended animation. The physical evidence, the synthetic textile fiber snagged on the brass window latch and the cardboard coffee cup, was carefully cataloged, sealed in an airtight evidence bag, and transferred from the Active Detective Bureau to the Municipal Police Department's dark, climate-controlled archive vaults. There, amidst rows of rusted filing cabinets and forgotten homicide boxes, the case awaited the slow, patient erosion of time. For Arthur Vance, the closing of the active investigation felt like a final, unearned victory. He slipped back into the shadows of obscurity, eventually relocating out of province and later settling into a quiet, low-profile existence in upstate New York, fully believing that his identical face and the limits of 1990s science had granted him permanent immunity from his sins. Yet, time is a double-edged sword that eventually cuts through the deepest layers of deception. While Arthur built a quiet life on the premise that his crime was safely buried in the past, the relentless march of forensic science was quietly constructing the tools of his ultimate undoing. As the calendar flipped into the advanced decades of the 21st century, a quiet revolution in forensic genomics began to reshape the landscape of criminal investigations worldwide. Breakthroughs in touch DNA extraction, next-generation sequencing, and advanced microvariant analysis opened doors that previous generations of detectives could only dream of unlocking. Crucially, forensic scientists developed sophisticated techniques capable of detecting subtle, somatic mutations unique to identical twins, mutations acquired through decades of differing environmental exposures, distinct lifestyle habits, cellular replication errors, and microvariations in DNA methylation. Cold case units across North America began re-examining historic evidence lockers with renewed vigor, realizing that microscopic traces long dismissed as useless could now speak with undeniable clarity. In Toronto, a specialized cold case task force partnering with advanced private forensic laboratories pulled the original 1995 evidence box for the Julian Vance homicide out of storage, setting their sights squarely on the seemingly mundane paper coffee cup recovered from the crime scene near the office entryway. Recognizing that the cup had absorbed microscopic skin cells and salivary proteins shed by whoever handled it on that fateful morning, geneticists applied state-of-the-art laser-assisted cell sorting and high-sensitivity extraction protocols. Against all historical odds, the laboratory successfully isolated a full, pristine touch DNA profile from the cup's rim. When subjected to advanced comparative analysis, the profile bypassed standard limitations, revealing subtle genetic microvariations that conclusively isolated a unique signature distinct from Julian Vance's known baseline, a signature that matched the genetic profile of his estranged twin brother, Arthur Vance. Armed with this groundbreaking forensic breakthrough, federal and local task force units launched a covert, high-stakes surveillance operation to track Arthur Vance across state lines. The tactical objective facing investigators was as delicate as it was critical. They needed to obtain a fresh, contemporaneous biological sample from Arthur without his knowledge, establishing an unassailable legal chain of custody for a comparative court presentation. For days, undercover operatives shadowed his daily routines, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of commuter trains, grocery store aisles, and local commercial districts, waiting patiently for the precise window of opportunity to present itself. That decisive moment arrived on a brisk Tuesday morning at a bustling regional airport terminal, where Arthur stopped at a terminal kiosk, purchased a hot beverage, and absent-mindedly discarded his paper coffee cup into a public recycling bin before proceeding toward his domestic flight departure gate. Within seconds of Arthur walking past the security threshold, an undercover investigator moved swiftly to the bin, retrieving the discarded cup with sterile precision and sealing it instantly inside an airtight biological evidence pouch. Rushed via emergency courier to the state forensic laboratory, the DNA extracted from the rim of the airport coffee cup was subjected to immediate, rigorous comparative profiling against the touch DNA profile preserved from the 1995 crime scene evidence. The results flashed across the high-resolution computer screen with terrifying, irrefutable clarity. A 100% biological match that bridged a 29-year chasm of deception, shattered the identical twin immunity barrier once and for all, and sealed Arthur Vance's catastrophic fate. Within hours of the laboratory confirmation, tactical law enforcement units closed in, executing a synchronized arrest as Arthur stepped off his connecting flight. Stripped of his decades-old illusion of absolute safety, his face drained of color as the cold steel handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists, marking the sudden, violent end of a nearly 3-decade evasion. Interrogated under relentless, unblinking lights in a sterile Toronto interrogation room, confronted with the undeniable microscopic proof of his presence at his brother's executive desk on that freezing November night in 1995, Arthur's icy composure finally fractured. In a choked, trembling whisper, he confessed to the cold-blooded execution, revealing how he had bypassed the corporate security system using stolen access codes, waited silently in the shadows of the executive suite, and gunned down his identical twin over a bitter dispute concerning financial ruin and consuming envy. The subsequent trial gripped the nation, dominating headlines and legal broadcasts as prosecutors laid bare the chilling mechanics of a fratricidal conspiracy executed behind the mask of identical biology. Legal experts hailed the verdict as a historic milestone in criminal jurisprudence, proving definitively that modern science can dismantle even the most sophisticated alibis and pierce the veil of twin genetics. Sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years, Arthur Vance was dispatched to a maximum security penitentiary, where he now spends his remaining days isolated in a concrete cell, a prisoner of the very time he thought he had successfully cheated. The ghost of Julian Vance, resting in peace beneath the Canadian soil, finally received the absolute justice denied to him for nearly 3 decades, leaving behind a haunting, eternal reminder that truth is a living force waiting patiently in the dark, ready to break through the silence whenever science, courage, and relentless dedication align. The fourth movement of this cinematic chronicle plunges deeper into the psychological abyss of the investigation, picking up the heavy, suffocating thread of mystery that defined the months following the initial deadlock of the Julian Vance homicide. As the calendar pages turn through the bitter winter of 1995 and into the thawing spring of 1996, the Downtown Homicide Division in Toronto found itself trapped in an agonizing professional vacuum. Detective Marcus Thorne, alongside his dedicated corps of investigators, watched as public outrage began to slowly curdle into a numbing, cynical resignation. The local press, having exhausted the initial shock value of a high-profile corporate assassination inside a secure downtown skyscraper, turned its collective gaze toward newer tragedies, leaving the Vance file to languish in the shadow of obscurity. Yet, inside the precinct, the silence of the case file was deafening. Thorne knew that a crime executed with such cold, surgical precision, where electronic security systems were deliberately disabled, physical evidence was virtually non-existent, and the primary suspect possessed an identical twin capable of wearing his face as an alibi, could not simply be explained away by administrative closure. The psychological toll on the investigative team was immense. Detectives who had spent sleepless nights analyzing every corporate document, cell tower log, and financial audit report found themselves haunted by the sheer audacity of the perpetrator. The killer had operated with a chilling sense of absolute impunity, banking on the limitations of 1995 forensic science and the terrifying legal shield provided by twin genetics. During those long, frustrating months, Thorne repeatedly reviewed the transcripts of Arthur Vance's initial interrogation, searching for the micro-expressions, the subtle slips of the tongue, or the emotional cracks that usually betray a guilty mind under pressure. But Arthur had given nothing away. His demeanor had been that of a glacial monolith, unshakable, eerily calm, and entirely shielded by the ironclad alibi of hotel receipts and witness testimony placing him 300 miles away in Montreal. The inability to puncture that alibi or differentiate the twins' biological signatures created a lingering sense of professional impotence that weighed heavily on the department's collective conscience. Beneath the surface of the stalled investigation, however, the cultural and emotional shockwaves continued to reverberate through Toronto's corporate and social fabric. Julian Vance's colleagues at the financial firm struggled to return to normalcy within an office building that now felt permanently shadowed by the memory of a violent execution. The multi-million-dollar subsidiary audit that Julian had been spearheading was quietly buried by corporate executives eager to protect their institutional reputations, while federal regulatory bodies found their inquiries stonewalled by complex legal maneuvering. The narrative of Julian's life, once defined by brilliance, ambition, and a promising future, was abruptly frozen in time, reduced to a tragic cautionary tale about the dark, destructive undercurrents of sibling rivalry and corporate ambition. Friends and surviving relatives grappled with an agonizing duality, knowing that the man responsible for the murder was likely walking free among them, protected by an identical face and an impenetrable wall of scientific limitation. As the years ground inexorably forward, turning a fresh homicide investigation into a formal cold case, the physical evidence gathered from the 32nd floor executive suite was meticulously packed, sealed, and transferred from active detective bureaus to the municipal police department's dark, climate-controlled archive vaults. Among those sealed boxes rested the tiny fragments of synthetic textile fiber snagged on the brass window latch and the seemingly mundane paper coffee cup recovered near the entryway. To the untrained eye, these items were lifeless relics of a dead investigation, useless pieces of cardboard and cloth doomed to gather dust for eternity. Yet, within the quiet sanctuary of those archive vaults, those microscopic items carried a silent, unyielding message. They were waiting patiently for a future that the detectives of 1995 could only dream of, a future where science would finally catch up to the cunning of a killer who thought he had outsmarted history. The narrative arc of the investigation thus entered a long, dormant hibernation, mirroring the quiet despair of cold cases across North America during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Law enforcement agencies were continually forced to confront the frustrating boundaries of forensic technology, where biological samples too small or degraded for standard testing were routinely abandoned to administrative backlog. Yet, every passing year represented a quiet, compounding victory for the invisible march of scientific innovation. While Arthur Vance built a quiet, obscure life in upstate New York, believing his crime was safely buried beneath decades of elapsed time, geneticists and molecular biologists across the globe were quietly engineering the revolutionary tools that would one day shatter his illusion of safety. The convergence of touch DNA extraction, next-generation sequencing, and microvariant genetic analysis was slowly taking shape in high-tech laboratories, preparing to rewrite the rules of criminal prosecution. The fourth movement thus serves as a dark, contemplative bridge between the initial panic of the 1995 crime scene and the triumphant scientific resurrection that would unfold nearly 3 decades later. It highlights the profound endurance of human grief and the quiet, persistent vigilance of investigators who refused to let a murdered man be forgotten. Though active field operations had ceased, the ghost of Julian Vance remained a permanent fixture in the institutional memory of the Toronto Police Service, a constant reminder that time, while often an accomplice to the wicked, is also the silent builder of truth's ultimate redemption. The stage was slowly being set for a technological reckoning, one that would transform a forgotten paper coffee cup into the most lethal piece of evidence in Canadian legal history. The fifth movement of this cinematic chronicle pivots from the dark dormancy of the cold case years into the brilliant, dazzling dawn of modern forensic genomics, tracking the quiet technological revolution that eventually resurrected the 1995 Julian Vance homicide investigation. For nearly 3 decades, the official case files sat locked inside the Municipal Police Department's climate-controlled archive vaults, its physical contents preserved like historical relics of an era when science was helpless against the identical twin immunity barrier. Yet, while the municipal archives remained frozen in time, the global scientific community was undergoing an unprecedented metamorphosis. By the early 2020s, advances in molecular biology, high-sensitivity DNA extraction, and next-generation sequencing had transformed the very definition of physical evidence. Investigators across North America began realizing that microscopic biological traces, once dismissed as useless background noise or inadequate samples, could now be coaxed into yielding rich, readable profiles capable of identifying individuals down to the most subtle genetic variations. Within a specialized cold case unit in Toronto, a renewed partnership with advanced private forensic DNA laboratories breathed unexpected life into the forgotten evidence boxes. Task Force detectives, driven by an institutional commitment to refuse permanent defeat, pulled the original 1995 evidence pertaining to Julian Vance's execution. Their primary target was not the complex corporate audit trails or the ambiguous synthetic fiber fragments, but a single, seemingly mundane item that had rested quietly inside the evidence envelope since the morning of the murder: the discarded, half-empty paper coffee cup recovered near the entryway of the executive suite. In 1995, that cardboard cup had been an evidentiary dead end, devoid of readable fingerprints and yielding nothing under the crude chemical testing protocols of the decade. But in the modern era of forensic science, a paper cup was viewed through an entirely different lens, not as a piece of trash, but as a rich, microscopic archive of human shedding, containing epidermal cells, salivary proteins, and cellular debris left behind by whoever had held or sipped from it on that freezing November dawn. The scientific challenge facing the modern laboratory technicians was nonetheless monumental. Even with advanced extraction tools, recovering a viable DNA profile from a 30-year-old degraded paper surface exposed to fluctuating ambient temperatures required surgical precision. Furthermore, the core biological dilemma remained. Even if a full-touch DNA profile was successfully extracted, standard short tandem repeat (STR) profiling could not differentiate between identical twins. Because Arthur Vance and his murdered brother shared identical nuclear DNA sequences, conventional testing would produce a matching profile for both men, leaving prosecutors legally paralyzed. To shatter this barrier, geneticists had to look beyond standard nuclear profiling, deploying cutting-edge microvariant sequencing and epigenetic analysis designed to detect subtle somatic mutations, unique DNA methylation patterns, and environmental microvariations accumulated through decades of divergent lifestyles, distinct cellular replication errors, and separate geographic exposures. In a sterile, high-security genomics laboratory, white-coated specialists executed laser-assisted cell sorting and high-sensitivity chemical extractions on the rim of the historical paper coffee cup. Hours of meticulous laboratory work hung in the balance as amplification cycles ran their course on high-throughput sequencers. Against all historical odds, the extraction yielded a stunning success, a full, pristine touch DNA profile of extraordinary quality. When subjected to advanced comparative genomic algorithms and microvariant sequencing, the results provided the breakthrough investigators had prayed for over 3 decades. The profile isolated from the coffee cup conclusively separated Arthur Vance's genetic signature from his deceased brother's baseline, revealing the subtle somatic markers that proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Arthur had been physically present in that executive suite on the night of the murder. The identical twin immunity barrier had been decisively, permanently breached by the unblinking eye of molecular science. Armed with this groundbreaking forensic confirmation, federal and local task force units transitioned immediately from the laboratory to the field, initiating a covert, high-stakes surveillance operation to track Arthur Vance. Now a weathered man in his late 50s, Arthur had spent the intervening decades cultivating an aura of complete security, living quietly under a radar of suburban obscurity in upstate New York. He maintained a modest lifestyle, avoiding large-scale digital footprints while believing that his identical face and the protective barrier of elapsed time had granted him total immunity. The operational objective facing the undercover surveillance team was delicate and uncompromising. They needed to obtain a fresh, contemporaneous biological sample from Arthur without his knowledge, establishing an unassailable legal chain of custody for an airtight comparative presentation in a Canadian court of law. For days, operatives blended seamlessly into the rhythm of Arthur's daily routines, shadowing his movements across commuter train platforms, grocery store aisles, and local commercial centers, waiting patiently for the precise window of opportunity to unfold. That decisive moment materialized on a crisp Tuesday morning at a bustling regional airport terminal, where Arthur stopped briefly at a public concourse kiosk, purchased a hot beverage, and absent-mindedly dropped his paper coffee cup into an open recycling bin before proceeding toward his domestic flight departure gate. Within seconds of Arthur stepping past the security threshold, an undercover investigator moved swiftly to the bin, retrieving the discarded cup with sterile precision and sealing it instantly inside an airtight biological evidence pouch. Flown via emergency courier to the State Forensic Laboratory, the DNA extracted from the rim of the airport coffee cup was subjected to immediate, rigorous comparative profiling against the touch DNA profile preserved from the 1995 crime scene evidence. The results flashed across the high-resolution computer screen with terrifying, irrefutable clarity. A 100% biological match that bridged a 29-year chasm of deception, shattered the identical twin immunity barrier once and for all, and sealed Arthur Vance's catastrophic fate. Within hours of the laboratory confirmation, tactical law enforcement units closed in, executing a synchronized arrest as Arthur stepped off his connecting flight. Stripped of his decades-old illusion of absolute safety, his face drained of color as the cold steel handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists, marking the sudden, violent end of a nearly 3-decade evasion. Interrogated under relentless, unblinking lights in a sterile Toronto interrogation room, confronted with the undeniable microscopic proof of his presence at his brother's executive desk on that freezing November night in 1995, Arthur's icy composure finally fractured. In a choked, trembling whisper, he confessed to the cold-blooded execution, revealing how he had bypassed the corporate security system using stolen access codes, waited silently in the shadows of the executive suite, and gunned down his identical twin over a bitter dispute concerning financial ruin and consuming envy. The subsequent trial gripped the nation, dominating headlines and legal broadcasts as prosecutors laid bare the chilling mechanics of a fratricidal conspiracy executed behind the mask of identical biology. Legal experts hailed the verdict as a historic milestone in criminal jurisprudence, proving definitively that modern science can dismantle even the most sophisticated alibis and pierce the veil of twin genetics. Sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years, Arthur Vance was dispatched to a maximum security penitentiary, where he now spends his remaining days isolated in a concrete cell, a prisoner of the very time he thought he had successfully cheated. The ghost of Julian Vance, resting in peace beneath the Canadian soil, finally received the absolute justice denied to him for nearly 3 decades, leaving behind a haunting, eternal reminder that truth is a living force waiting patiently in the dark, ready to break through the silence whenever science, courage, and relentless dedication align. The 6th movement of this cinematic chronicle dives headfirst into the high-stakes operational theater of the modern surveillance operation, tracking the meticulous, heartbeat-by-heart execution of the Federal Task Force's plan to intercept Arthur Vance without alerting his suspicions. With the pristine Touch DNA profile successfully extracted from the historical paper coffee cup and matched through microvariant sequencing to separate identical twin signatures, the Toronto Cold Case Unit possessed the biological key to unlock the 1995 murder. Yet, knowing the truth in a secure laboratory and proving it within the unyielding confines of a Canadian courtroom required an immaculate, legally unimpeachable chain of custody. Task Force commanders knew they could not arrest Arthur based solely on archival evidence preserved for nearly 3 decades. They needed a fresh, contemporaneous biological sample obtained in real time, under strict observation, establishing an absolute, unbroken link between the aging fugitive in upstate New York and the killer who had walked through the executive suite on that freezing November dawn.
TXT.
+2. The operation was planned with the tactical precision of a military intelligence mission. Federal and local task force operatives, working in clandestine coordination across international jurisdictions, established around-the-clock surveillance net around Arthur Vance's suburban residence in upstate New York. For days, undercover agents blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the neighborhood, watching as Arthur, now a weathered man in his late 50s, went about his unassuming daily routines. He patronized local grocery stores, rode morning commuter trains into the regional hub, and occasionally stopped at neighborhood diners, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the world had long forgotten his past. Every movement was logged, every public appearance recorded, and every potential exposure point meticulously mapped by tactical planners who understood that they had exactly one chance to secure a pristine sample without tipping their hand. The operational window narrowed dramatically when intelligence reports intercepted a digital flight itinerary indicating that Arthur was planning a multi-state domestic business trip, utilizing regional commuter airports that offered minimal security screening but predictable pedestrian bottlenecks. Task Force leadership recognized that an airport terminal represented the ideal hunting ground, a controlled public environment where crowds, security checkpoints, and mandatory transit kiosks naturally forced individuals to handle personal items, consume beverages, and discard single-use containers into designated public bins. A specialized tactical surveillance team, trained in covert evidence collection and high-speed target tracking, was immediately dispatched to intercept Arthur at his departure terminal, carrying specialized sterile evidence pouches, latex barrier gloves, and high-definition optical recording equipment. The morning of the operation broke under a pale, overcast sky that mirrored the tense, hyper-focused atmosphere inside the unmarked surveillance vehicles staking out the airport parking structure. Operative Marcus Thorne, now serving in an advisory capacity as a senior cold case coordinator, monitored the encrypted radio channels from the tactical command van as Arthur Vance stepped out of a rideshare vehicle, hoisted a modest canvas travel bag over his shoulder, and strode toward the automated sliding doors of the main terminal entrance. Arthur appeared outwardly calm, dressed in a nondescript dark jacket and carrying himself with the practiced anonymity of a frequent traveler. Operatives maintained a safe, invisible distance, trailing him through the echoing departure hall as he navigated the ticketing counters and approached a bustling terminal concession kiosk to purchase a hot beverage before proceeding toward his assigned boarding gate. Inside the crowded terminal, undercover operative Sarah Jenkins positioned herself near a bank of public recycling receptacles just 20 feet from Arthur's location, blending effortlessly into a cluster of morning commuters. She watched with laser-like focus as Arthur purchased his beverage, took a few sips while reviewing his digital boarding pass, and then, in a casual, routine motion, dropped the half-empty paper coffee cup directly into an open public recycling bin before walking briskly toward the security screening threshold. The crucial microsecond had arrived. As Arthur's figure vanished into the security queue, Jenkins moved instantly toward the bin with disciplined urgency. With gloved hands moving with absolute surgical precision, she bypassed the crumpled newspapers and plastic bottles, retrieved the discarded paper cup by its lower base, and immediately sealed it inside an airtight biological evidence pouch to prevent cross-contamination or environmental degradation. Within minutes of the secure retrieval, the sealed evidence pouch was handed off to an emergency courier waiting outside the terminal loading zone, who gunned the engine and rocketed toward the state forensic laboratory under a priority transport escort. Back at the high-security genomics facility, waiting specialists were already prepped for an immediate, accelerated extraction protocol. Laboratory Director Dr. Helen Vance, unrelated to the victims but possessing decades of specialized expertise in low copy number profiling, supervised the direct chemical swabbing of the cup's upper rim, where salivary amylase and shed epithelial cells were concentrated. Using high-throughput amplification kits and advanced capillary electrophoresis instruments, the laboratory bypassed traditional multi-hour waiting periods, running continuous diagnostic cycles to isolate a clean, high-resolution STR and microvariant DNA profile from the fresh sample. The laboratory clock ticked loudly against the tense silence of the analytical suite as the computer software processed the final electropherogram peaks. At precisely 2:42 p.m., the comparative matching algorithm executed its final verification against the touch DNA profile extracted from the 1995 crime scene coffee cup stored in the Toronto archives. The monitor flashed a brilliant, undeniable confirmation, a 100% identical biological match across all core loci, including the subtle somatic microvariants unique to identical twin genetics. The room erupted in a collective breath of profound relief and vindication. The paper coffee cup discarded in a bustling airport terminal had successfully bridged a 29-year chasm of deception, shattering the identical twin immunity barrier once and for all, and securing the definitive legal proof required to bring Arthur Vance to justice. Armed with the unassailable laboratory results, task force commanders executed the final phase of the operation with lightning speed. Synchronized arrest orders were flashed to tactical units stationed at Arthur's connecting destination airport hundreds of miles away. As Arthur stepped off the jet bridge into the terminal corridor, expecting a routine business connection, heavy hands descended upon his shoulders. The cold steel of handcuffs locked tightly around his wrists, cutting short his decades-long illusion of absolute safety and marking the abrupt, violent termination of his evasion. Stripped of his freedom and confronted by the overwhelming weight of modern science, Arthur's stoic facade finally crumbled into stunned silence, setting the stage for the final, cathartic reckoning inside the interrogation rooms of Toronto. The seventh movement of this gripping cinematic narrative plunges directly into the sterile, unyielding atmosphere of the Toronto Police Service interrogation suite, where the final, electric confrontation between law enforcement and Arthur Vance took place. Following his synchronized apprehension at the connecting airport terminal and his emergency extradition back across the Canadian border, Arthur was led down the long, linoleum-lined corridors of the downtown precinct into Interview Room B, a windowless box illuminated by a harsh, low-hanging fluorescent fixture that cast a sickly amber glow over the scratched metal table. The air inside the room was heavy with the palpable tension of a nearly 3-decade-old ghost finally being dragged into the blinding light of accountability. Stripped of his luggage, his commercial anonymity, and the comforting suburban routine he had carefully cultivated in upstate New York, Arthur sat alone in a bolted chair, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes darting toward the two-way mirror that concealed the watchful eyes of the cold case task force detectives standing just inches away in the observation gallery. The heavy steel door swung open with a sharp, pneumatic click, and Detective Marcus Thorne, now standing alongside lead investigator Sarah Jenkins, stepped into the room, carrying a single, thick manila folder containing the accumulated weight of 29 years of unyielding police persistence. Thorne did not offer a polite greeting or engage in introductory pleasantries. He pulled out the metal chair opposite Arthur, sat down with deliberate slowness, and placed the evidence log squarely in the center of the table. For several agonizing moments, absolute silence blanketed the room, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the overhead air ventilation duct. Arthur attempted to maintain a veneer of icy, dismissive composure, shifting his jaw and crossing his arms across his chest, offering a strained, mocking smirk as he muttered that there had clearly been a catastrophic administrative error and that he demanded his legal representation immediately. Thorne ignored the demand for counsel, leaning forward until his face caught the full glare of the overhead light and calmly slid a single 8 by 10 glossy photograph across the table. It was an archival crime scene photograph depicting the interior of the 32nd floor executive suite from November 1995, showing Julian Vance slumped motionless across his mahogany desk, bathed in the silent horror of his final moment. Arthur's confident smirk flickered instantly, his facial muscles tightening and the color rapidly draining from his cheeks as his gaze locked onto the image of his identical twin brother. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, but he forced himself to look away, shaking his head with feigned disgust and repeating in a rigid, robotic cadence that he had been 300 miles away in Montreal on that night, backed by a bulletproof alibi that police had failed to break back in 1995. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, leaning over the table to place a second document beside the crime scene photograph. The high-resolution laboratory analysis report detailing the mitochondrial and microvariant DNA match extracted from the airport terminal coffee cup, directly cross-referenced against the Touch DNA profile lifted from the paper coffee cup recovered at the 1995 crime scene. Jenkins laid out the scientific narrative with devastating, clinical precision, explaining how next-generation forensic sequencing had bypassed the identical twin immunity barrier by detecting the subtle somatic mutations and epigenetic variations that accumulated through decades of separate lives, distinct cellular division, and individual environmental exposures. She looked directly into Arthur's wide, trembling hazel eyes that were an exact biological mirror of the dead man in the photograph, and quietly told him that science had finally pierced the mask he had worn for nearly 30 years, leaving his old alibi completely worthless in a modern court of law. The psychological armor that Arthur Vance had spent 29 years constructing began to splinter under the relentless, crushing weight of undeniable empirical science. His breath hitched, his hands began to tremble uncontrollably against the cold metal surface of the table, and the cold, arrogant facade he had worn since his arrest melted away, exposing the terrified, cornered fugitive beneath. He stared back and forth between the two detectives and the devastating laboratory reports, realizing with horrifying clarity that every lie, every clever evasion, and every mile he had traveled to escape his past had been completely neutralized by a microscopic trace left on a disposable coffee cup in an airport terminal. The silence in the interrogation room grew deafening, charged with the electric realization that the 30-year-old mystery was finally reaching its inevitable, violent conclusion. With a ragged, broken sigh that seemed to expel decades of suppressed panic, Arthur's shoulders finally collapsed inward. He slumped forward, burying his face in his trembling hands as a low, choked sob escaped his throat, signaling the complete dissolution of his denial. In a halting, tear-choked whisper that barely registered above the hum of the ventilation fan, he began to speak, confessing and agonizing, step-by-step detail to how he had bypassed the corporate security system using stolen administrative access codes on that freezing November dawn, waited silently in the dark shadow of the executive suite, and pulled the trigger on his identical twin over a festering vortex of consuming envy and financial desperation. The full, unvarnished confession was captured permanently on digital audio and video recorders, sealing a definitive, unshakable legal victory for the task force and closing the darkest chapter in Toronto's modern criminal history. The eighth movement of this cinematic narrative plunges deep into the dramatic transition from the claustrophobic interrogation room to the sweeping, high-stakes theater of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, where the machinery of modern Canadian jurisprudence prepared to put Arthur Vance on trial. Following his explosive confession inside the Toronto Police Service precinct, the public prosecutor's office moved swiftly to file formal charges of first-degree murder, transforming a decades-old cold case legend into an active, headline-dominating judicial proceeding. The media frenzy that erupted outside the courthouse steps on the opening morning of the pretrial hearings was unprecedented. Satellite trucks lined Queen Street West. International true crime documentarians jostled for position against local reporters, and the public sidewalk was packed shoulder to shoulder with curious onlookers eager to witness the final chapter of a murder mystery that had haunted the city's collective consciousness for nearly 30 years. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with legal anticipation, structured by the rigid protocols of the Canadian legal system and charged with the electric realization that this trial would establish a groundbreaking legal precedent regarding the admissibility of modern touch DNA and identical twin forensic microvariants. As the presiding judge, Justice Robert Sterling, a seasoned jurist known for his sharp intellect and unyielding command of courtroom decorum, rapped his gavel to call the court to order. The defense team, led by veteran criminal defense counsel Marcus Sterling, no relation, immediately launched a barrage of aggressive pretrial motions aimed at dismantling the Crown's physical evidence. Defense counsel argued strenuously that the touch DNA extracted from the 1995 paper coffee cup had been subjected to decades of environmental degradation while sitting in municipal archive vaults, suggesting potential cross-contamination during its initial collection or subsequent storage. Furthermore, the defense attacked the admissibility of the airport terminal coffee cup sample, claiming that the undercover operative's retrieval of the discarded cup constituted an unreasonable search and seizure under Section 8 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as Arthur Vance had not explicitly abandoned his reasonable expectation of privacy over personal biological waste discarded in a public transit terminal. The Crown prosecutors, anchored by senior trial counsel Elizabeth Vance, who shared no familial connection to the victim, met the defense's constitutional challenges with an unshakable wall of empirical evidence and pristine legal precedent. They called to the witness stand a succession of world-renowned forensic geneticists, molecular biologists, and evidence custody officers who methodically dismantled every technical objection raised by the defense. Dr. Helen Vance testified at length regarding the rigorous chain of custody maintained during the retrieval of the airport coffee cup, detailing how sterile protocols, laser-assisted cell sorting, and advanced low-copy number PCR amplification had preserved the integrity of the genetic material. More importantly, the Crown presented comprehensive, peer-reviewed scientific validation proving that next-generation sequencing and microvariant profiling could successfully isolate somatic mutations and epigenetic differences between identical twins, effectively demolishing the 29-year-old legal myth that twin biology offered an impenetrable shield against criminal prosecution. Justice Sterling delivered a meticulous, highly anticipated oral ruling on the third day of pretrial motions, dismissing the defense's charter applications in their entirety. He ruled that a disposable coffee cup dropped into a public airport terminal recycling bin legally constituted abandoned property, stripping the user of any reasonable expectation of privacy under Canadian constitutional law. Furthermore, the judge praised the unprecedented precision of the modern forensic techniques employed by the state, officially ruling that the touch DNA profiles and identical twin microvariant analyses from both the 1995 crime scene and the airport terminal were fully admissible as expert scientific evidence before the jury. The courtroom gallery erupted in a quiet murmur of tension as the formal selection of the 12 jurors commenced, setting the stage for a dramatic, high-stakes trial that would pit the dark history of a frozen November night against the dazzling, unsparing light of 21st-century forensic science. The ninth movement of this cinematic narrative plunges directly into the crucible of the courtroom testimony, where the emotional apex of the trial unfolded before a spellbound jury inside the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. The morning sun cut through the tall, arched windows of the historic courtroom, casting long, sharp beams across the mahogany benches as senior trial counsel Elizabeth Vance rose to deliver the Crown's opening statements. The courtroom was agonizingly quiet. Every spectator, journalist, and legal clerk leaned forward, listening intently as her measured, commanding voice mapped out the grim chronology of November 1995. She did not rely on emotional appeals alone, but rather constructed an unyielding bridge between the dark legacy of the past and the brilliant, clarifying light of modern science. She promised the jury that the state would not merely present a theory of guilt, but would demonstrate through indisputable empirical proof how a discarded paper coffee cup had successfully pierced the ancient shield of identical twin genetics, capturing the murderer in a trap he never knew existed. The prosecution's evidentiary presentation moved with methodical, devastating precision. Over the course of the next 4 days, a parade of expert witnesses took the stand, transforming complex molecular biology into a gripping narrative that held the courtroom captive. Dr. Helen Vance was recalled to testify, guiding the jurors through the intricate science of touch DNA extraction, low copy number PCR amplification, and next-generation sequencing. Using large digital displays set up in the center of the well, she illustrated how human skin cells and salivary proteins left behind on porous surfaces could survive decades of archival storage if kept within climate-controlled environments. More crucially, she explained the groundbreaking microvariant and epigenetic analysis that allowed her laboratory to distinguish between identical twins, individuals who share the same baseline nuclear DNA but accumulate distinct somatic mutations and methylation patterns through decades of separate environments, divergent lifestyle choices, and individual cellular replication errors. The defense cross-examination attempted to sow seeds of doubt regarding sample degradation and archive chain-of-custody protocols, but Dr. Helen Vance's calm, authoritative composure, and peer-reviewed data completely dismantled their objections, leaving the technical validity of the DNA match intact and unassailable. The emotional core of the trial shifted dramatically when Detective Marcus Thorne took the witness stand to recount the initial, grueling weeks of the 1995 investigation. Speaking in a gravelly, measured tone that conveyed decades of accumulated professional weight, Thorne described the frustration of standing inside the 32nd floor executive suite, staring at a crime scene stripped of foreign fingerprints, devoid of ballistic clues, and protected by an impenetrable alibi. He walked the jury through the terrifying paradox of identical twins, explaining how he and his fellow detectives had looked straight into Arthur Vance's face during the initial interrogation, knowing instinctively that he was the killer, yet remaining utterly powerless under the legal and technological limitations of the era to prove it. Thorne's testimony anchored the human element of the tragedy, painting a poignant picture of a cold case that had refused to die, haunting the institutional memory of the Toronto Police Service for nearly 30 agonizing years. The tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch during the cross-examination of the defense's primary witnesses and the subsequent introduction of the recorded custodial interrogation. When the Crown requested permission to play the audio-video recording of Arthur Vance's post-arrest confession in Interview Room B, Justice Robert Sterling granted the motion immediately. The courtroom speakers crackled to life, filling the silent hall with the sound of Arthur's broken, trembling voice as he confessed step by step to the cold-blooded execution of his identical twin brother. Jurors watched the screen as the projection showed Arthur breaking down, burying his face in his hands, and detailing how he had bypassed the corporate security system using stolen access codes, waited silently in the dark shadow of the office tower, and pulled the trigger over a bitter vortex of financial ruin and consuming envy. The impact of the video confession inside the courtroom was profound. Several spectators gasped. Defense counsel sat in stunned, rigid silence, and the illusion of Arthur's innocence evaporated completely under the crushing weight of his own spoken words. As the prosecution rested its case, the defense presented a brief, largely perfunctory closing argument, focusing heavily on minor procedural discrepancies in the handling of the airport coffee cup evidence and appealing to the jury's sense of reasonable doubt regarding archival contamination. However, their arguments felt hollow and weightless against the overwhelming mass of scientific and circumstantial evidence assembled by the Crown. In her blistering closing address, Elizabeth Vance reminded the jury that time is not an accomplice to the wicked when science is marching forward, and that a killer cannot hide forever behind a twin brother's face when modern technology has learned to read the invisible fingerprints of our somatic evolution. The courtroom sat in breathless suspension as Justice Sterling began delivering his comprehensive final instructions to the jury, charging them to weigh the evidence without bias and preparing the stage for the historic verdict that would bring a 3-decade nightmare to its definitive close. The 10th movement of this sprawling cinematic chronicle plunges deep into the solemn, heavy atmosphere of the jury deliberation room and the momentous delivery of the verdict inside the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. Following Justice Robert Sterling's comprehensive, meticulous instructions, which spanned over 3 hours and guided the 12 jurors through the complex intersections of circumstantial evidence, touch DNA validity, and identical twin microvariant science, the jury retired to sequester themselves behind closed doors. The courtroom gallery dissolved into a tense, anxious murmur as reporters, legal analysts, family members, and members of the public poured out into the marble-columned corridors of the courthouse. Outside, the midday sun beat down against the stone facade, while satellite trucks maintained their relentless vigil, broadcasting live updates to a nation that had become completely captivated by the trial's unprecedented scientific breakthroughs. Inside the sequestered room, the jurors faced an awesome, historic responsibility to weigh the accumulated weight of a 29-year cold case against the unyielding standards of criminal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The initial hours of deliberation were marked by deep, analytical gravity rather than immediate conflict. The jury foreman, a retired high school chemistry teacher named Arthur Miller, a coincidence of nomenclature that felt heavy with irony, called for an initial, unvoiced straw ballot to gauge the room's collective mindset. When the slips of paper were collected and tallied on the central whiteboard, the result was a decisive alignment. 10 jurors favoring a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, with 2 holding out for further review of the defense's technical arguments regarding the chain of custody of the airport terminal coffee cup. Rather than rushing to judgment, Miller established a methodical, structured review process, directing the panel to systematically break down the evidence into 3 distinct chronological pillars: the execution-style murder of Julian Vance in November 1995, the technological dead ends and identical twin limitations of that era, and the modern forensic resurrection achieved through touch DNA and microvariant genomic sequencing. For the remainder of the afternoon and well into the evening hours, the jurors re-examined the physical exhibit's layout, poring over the high-resolution electropherogram charts presented by Dr. Helen Vance and rereading the transcripts of Arthur Vance's post-arrest confession in Interview Room B. The 2 holdout jurors, initially concerned about the potential for environmental degradation during 30 years of municipal archival storage, focused intently on the rigorous cross-examination testimony of the forensic experts. They scrutinized the laser-assisted cell sorting protocols, the strict temperature logs of the evidence vaults, and the peer-reviewed validation studies proving that somatic mutations and methylation patterns could successfully differentiate identical twins. As the technical evidence was cross-referenced against the recorded video of Arthur's emotional, broken confession, where he detailed step-by-step how he used stolen corporate security codes to bypass the building's electronic grid and terminate his brother, the last remaining technical doubts dissolved into absolute certainty. By late evening, as the city lights of downtown Toronto cast a glittering amber reflection across the courthouse windows, the buzzer sounded from the jury deliberation room, signaling to the court bailiff that a unanimous verdict had been reached. A sudden, electric wave of tension swept through the building as emergency page notifications summoned the trial lawyers, the media corps, and the public back into the historic courtroom. Detective Marcus Thorne and lead investigator Sarah Jenkins took their seats in the front row of the gallery, their faces etched with the profound, quiet weariness of men and women who had spent decades carrying the unyielding weight of an unsolved tragedy. As Arthur Vance was led back into the courtroom through the secure prisoner doors, his posture was rigidly defensive, his eyes avoiding the gaze of the packed gallery as he settled into the defense table beside his counsel. The air in the room grew hyper-focused, heavy with the breathless anticipation of history in the making. Justice Robert Sterling swept back onto the bench with solemn dignity, his robes rustling softly in the hushed silence. With a brief, formal nod, he instructed the jury foreman to deliver the verdict. Miller rose slowly from his seat in the jury box, holding a crisp white envelope containing the formal declaration. His voice, steady and clear, echoed off the high oak paneling of the courtroom walls as he addressed the bench. Your Honor, on the single count of first-degree murder in the death of Julian Vance, we find the accused, Arthur Vance, guilty. The words struck the courtroom with the force of a physical blow. A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery, followed by an immediate, reverent hush as the full magnitude of the legal pronouncement settled over the room. Arthur Vance slumped forward in his chair, his head dropping into his hands as the iron reality of his conviction finally crushed the last vestiges of his decades-long evasion. Justice Sterling thanked the jury for their extraordinary civic dedication, formally accepted the verdict, and scheduled the mandatory sentencing hearing for the following month, bringing a definitive, historic close to the 10th movement of a case that forever transformed the intersection of modern science and criminal justice. The 11th and final movement of this cinematic chronicle opens upon the quiet, austere landscape of the maximum security penitentiary where Arthur Vance now serves his life sentence, marking the ultimate closure of a narrative that began on a freezing November dawn in 1995. The high concrete walls, topped with coils of razor wire and monitored by automated security turrets, stand in stark contrast to the gleaming corporate towers of downtown Toronto, where Julian Vance once built his brilliant, tragic career. Inside his isolated cell, stripped of every luxury, every personal possession, and the comforting illusion of suburban anonymity that he had meticulously cultivated for nearly 3 decades, Arthur exists as a ghost of his former self, a prisoner trapped not merely by the concrete bars of a maximum security institution, but by the immutable, unsparing truth of modern science. The identical face that once served as his ultimate shield and alibi has become his permanent monument of shame, recognized by guards and inmates alike as the visage of a fratricidal killer who thought he could outsmart both history and human biology. The broader societal and legal legacy of the Julian Vance cold case continues to reverberate across international jurisdictions, fundamentally reshaping how modern law enforcement agencies approach historical homicides involving identical twins. For decades, the identical twin immunity barrier represented one of the most frustrating legal and biological dead ends in criminal jurisprudence, a ghost wall that allowed perpetrators who shared identical nuclear DNA to walk free under the protective shadow of their siblings' genomic blueprint. The groundbreaking integration of touch DNA extraction, next-generation sequencing, and microvariant epigenetic analysis employed in the Vance case shattered that ancient barrier forever. Legal scholars, forensic pathologists, and investigative task forces worldwide now study the Toronto cold case as a landmark turning point, proof positive that science can successfully parse somatic mutations and environmental microvariations to distinguish between clones, turning a single discarded paper coffee cup into an unassailable instrument of absolute justice. Yet, beyond the laboratory breakthroughs and the landmark judicial precedents, the true legacy of the case belongs to the enduring memory of Julian Vance and the unyielding institutional persistence of the investigators who refused to let his murder fade into oblivion. Detective Marcus Thorne, now fully retired from active duty but forever tethered to the legacy of the file, frequently visits the quiet municipal cemetery where Julian rests beneath the Canadian soil. Standing before the polished stone marker, Thorne often reflects on the invisible threads of time, courage, and technological redemption that finally bridged the 29-year chasm between a silent crime scene and a prison cell. The paper coffee cup discarded on that fateful morning in 1995, long dismissed as a worthless relic of a dead investigation, became the silent witness that refused to stay silent, proving that truth is a living force waiting patiently in the dark, ready to break through the silence whenever science, dedication, and human resolve align to reclaim the light. The 12th and final movement of this cinematic true crime epic brings us to the profound philosophical and existential horizon of the Julian Vance case, transcending the immediate boundaries of courtroom victories, maximum security confinement, and forensic milestones to reflect on the enduring nature of human memory, justice, and the relentless march of time. As the years settle into a quiet rhythm following Arthur Vance's historic conviction, the city of Toronto continues its dizzying ascent into the future, its gleaming glass towers reaching ever higher toward the Canadian sky. Yet beneath the shimmering surface of the modern metropolis lies a deeply etched, permanent scar. The 32nd floor executive office where Julian Vance's brilliant life was abruptly extinguished on that freezing November dawn in 1995 has long since been remodeled, its mahogany desks replaced, its carpets changed, and its walls repainted to accommodate new generations of ambitious corporate analysts who walk the corridors entirely unaware of the blood-soaked history embedded in the concrete beneath their feet. Yet, history is not merely measured in physical renovations or the shifting skylines of real estate development. History is defined by the moral weight of unresolved tragedies and the profound, unyielding human refusal to let the innocent be swallowed permanently by the dark silence of oblivion. Retired Detective Marcus Thorne, now navigating the quiet, reflective twilight of his life, often finds himself drawn back to the contemplative solitude of the municipal archives and the serene, windswept pathways of the cemetery where Julian rests beneath a modest, weathered granite headstone. For Thorne, the resolution of the Vance case was not merely professional closure or a notch on a cold case task force's ledger. It was a deeply spiritual vindication of a lifelong creed. Throughout nearly 3 decades of chasing phantoms, enduring administrative indifference, and staring blankly at evidence boxes filled with seemingly useless fragments of cloth and cardboard, Thorne had never truly surrendered his faith in the ultimate inevitability of truth. Standing beside Julian's grave, the old detective often contemplates the strange, mystical geometry of fate that connected a humble, disposable paper coffee cup discarded on a chilly morning in 1995 with an identical coffee cup dropped decades later in a bustling airport terminal thousands of miles away. It was a staggering reminder that human beings leave invisible signatures scattered across the physical world, micro-traces of our existence that time can obscure but never entirely erase, waiting patiently for the exact moment when science, courage, and human dedication finally align to illuminate the dark. The broader societal ripple effects of the trial continue to echo across international academic institutions, medical laboratories, and legal classrooms, transforming the Julian Vance homicide into a foundational curriculum benchmark for the 21st century. Criminal law textbooks now feature dedicated chapters analyzing the landmark precedent established by Justice Robert Sterling's rulings on identical twin microvariant genetics and public property abandonment laws regarding discarded biological waste. Forensic genomics programs worldwide cite the Toronto cold case as the ultimate empirical proof that the ancient, frustrating barrier of identical twin immunity has been permanently dismantled by next-generation sequencing, epigenetic profiling, and touch DNA extraction. Prosecutors and defense counsels alike study the meticulous chain of custody protocols maintained by Dr. Helen Vance and her team, recognizing that the courtroom battle over the airport coffee cup redefined the legal definition of physical evidence in an era where digital and biological traces blur seamlessly together. The case stands as a shining beacon of hope for thousands of forgotten families across the globe whose loved ones remain trapped in the cold, stagnant files of unsolved mysteries, offering an unyielding promise that no crime is ever truly timeless and no killer can hide forever behind the mask of identical biology. Yet, beyond the grand halls of academia and the high-tech precision of molecular genetics, the true, lasting legacy of this cinematic chronicle resides in the quiet spaces of human empathy and the sacred duty of remembrance. Julian Vance was not merely a data point in a statistical study, a footnote in a forensic manual, or a ghost haunting a cold case archive. He was a vibrant, brilliant young man whose laughter, intellect, ambitions, and dreams were violently stolen in the prime of his life by a consuming vortex of sibling envy and corporate greed. The betrayal he suffered was all the more agonizing because it came from the one human being on Earth who shared his exact face, a horrific perversion of the miraculous bond of twinship that turned the mirror of life into an instrument of execution. For nearly 30 years, Julian's memory was eclipsed by the impenetrable wall of his brother's silence and the helpless limitations of an earlier scientific era. But history, in its own deliberate and unforgiving way, eventually reclaimed what belonged to the light. As the sun sets over the Canadian landscape, casting long, golden amber shadows across the maximum security penitentiary where Arthur Vance spends his remaining days isolated in a sterile concrete cell, the final echoes of this dark chapter fade into the vast expanse of time. Arthur is left entirely alone with the deafening silence of his choices, a prisoner of his own immutable biology and the inescapable truth that every lie eventually collapses under the weight of an unyielding dawn. Meanwhile, the memory of Julian Vance endures, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as an eternal testament to the indomitable power of human persistence, the quiet heroism of investigators who never gave up, and the miraculous, redemptive awakening of a science that learned to read the invisible signatures of our shared existence. The ghost of the 32nd floor office has finally found its rest, leaving behind a timeless, haunting truth that justice, though it may sleep for decades, is a living force waiting patiently in the dark, ready to break through the silence whenever the world summons the courage to seek the light. The 13th and ultimate concluding movement of this sweeping cinematic true crime epic transcends the linear boundaries of the narrative to contemplate the profound metaphysical ripples left in the wake of the Julian Vance investigation, exploring the timeless dialogue between human morality, technological evolution, and the eternal quest for cosmic balance. As the years continue their relentless forward march, carrying the city of Toronto further into the vast expanse of the 21st century, the collective memory of the city has woven the Vance cold case into its permanent historical folklore. It is no longer just a localized tragedy of corporate intrigue and fraternal betrayal, but a universal touchstone, a modern parable about the inevitability of truth and the inescapable gravity of human accountability. The towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district continue to mirror the shifting clouds of the Canadian sky, yet beneath their gleaming facades, the foundational bedrock of the city carries the quiet, enduring resonance of a case that redefined the boundaries of what is possible when science and human persistence refuse to yield to the dark. For retired Detective Marcus Thorne, the passing years have brought a profound, settled peace, a quiet tranquility born from the knowledge that his life's work achieved its ultimate, transcendent purpose. Though his badge is long since retired and his days are spent watching the changing seasons from the porch of his suburban home, Thorne remains eternally tethered to the legacy of the file that defined his professional existence. He often thinks back to those endless nights in the 1995 homicide bullpen, staring blankly at the cold, unyielding wall of identical twin immunity and the silent, mocking stillness of the evidence boxes. The journey from that paralyzing despair to the triumphant courtroom verdict stands as a living testament to the miraculous arc of human ingenuity. Thorne's legacy is etched not in monuments of stone or bronze, but in the unyielding standard of professional tenacity he passed down to a new generation of investigators, a standard built on the unbreakable conviction that no human life is ever truly disposable and no mystery is ever permanently beyond the reach of human courage. The ripples of the trial's precedent continue to reverberate across global scientific academies, medical research laboratories, and international law enforcement symposia, ensuring that the lessons learned from Julian and Arthur Vance will protect future generations. Forensic genomics departments across the world now incorporate the landmark microvariant protocols and touch DNA extraction methodologies pioneered in the Toronto cold case into their standard academic curricula, training the upcoming vanguard of criminal investigators to view seemingly worthless environmental debris through an entirely new lens. The humble paper coffee cup, once the ultimate symbol of forensic helplessness in the mid-1990s, has been permanently elevated to the pantheon of forensic legend, a humble household object transformed by science into an instrument of absolute truth. Legal scholars and constitutional courts continue to debate and refine the parameters of public property abandonment and privacy expectations based on Justice Robert Sterling's historic rulings, ensuring that the legal framework of modern jurisprudence evolves hand in hand with the breathtaking advancements of molecular biology. Yet, as the theoretical debates fade into academic textbooks and the legal precedents become codified into the permanent bedrock of criminal law, the true emotional core of this cinematic journey remains anchored in the sacred duty of remembrance for Julian Vance. Julian's life was cut short in its absolute prime, his brilliant intellect, his infectious laughter, and his boundless potential stolen away by an act of incomprehensible malice born from the darkest recesses of human envy. The horror of his betrayal, perpetrated by the one person on Earth who shared his exact biological signature, turning the sacred mirror of twinship into an instrument of cold-blooded execution, will forever remain one of the most chilling chapters in criminal history. For nearly 3 decades, his voice was silenced, buried beneath the weight of scientific limitation and the arrogant confidence of a killer who believed he had outsmarted history. But history, in its own slow, unyielding, and majestic way, eventually reclaimed what belonged to the light, proving that truth is not a fragile human construct, but a living, breathing force waiting patiently in the dark. As the final shadows lengthen across the Canadian landscape, stretching from the maximum security penitentiary cell where Arthur Vance spends his remaining days isolated in eternal silence, all the way to the peaceful municipal cemetery where Julian Vance rests beneath the quiet earth, the narrative circle is finally and perfectly closed. Arthur is left entirely alone with the deafening emptiness of his choices, a prisoner of his own immutable biology and the inescapable reality that every lie, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually collapses under the weight of an unyielding dawn. Meanwhile, the memory of Julian Vance endures, not as a monument to tragedy, but as a radiant, eternal testament to the indomitable power of human persistence, the quiet heroism of investigators who never surrendered, and the miraculous, redemptive awakening of a science that learned to read the invisible signatures of our shared existence. The ghost of the 32nd floor office has finally found its rest, leaving behind a timeless, haunting truth that will echo down through the ages, that justice, though it may sleep for decades, is a living force waiting patiently in the dark, ready to break through the silence whenever the world summons the courage to seek the light. The 14th movement of this true crime epic expands the narrative lens into a haunting, introspective study of the psychological aftermath left in the wake of the trial, exploring how a city, a police service, and the surviving fragments of a fractured family rebuild their lives after the veil of twin deception has been permanently lifted. Long after the satellite television trucks packed up their satellite dishes outside the Ontario Superior Court of Justice and the sensational international headlines faded from the daily news cycle, the quiet work of processing lingering trauma began. For the citizens of Toronto, the resolution of the Julian Vance homicide was more than just a victory for modern forensic science. It was an unburdening of a collective conscience. For nearly 3 decades, the 32nd floor executive suite had existed as a silent, localized monument to unresolved evil, a lingering reminder that a calculated murderer had walked among them in plain sight, wearing the identical face of his victim and using the limits of 1990s technology to mock the very concept of justice. Inside the halls of the Toronto Police Service's Homicide Bureau, the atmosphere shifted from the high-octane adrenaline of an active investigation to a quiet, profound institutional pride. The physical evidence boxes that had spent decades gathering dust in the climate-controlled archive vaults were officially processed for permanent historical preservation or court-ordered archive retention. The paper coffee cup, the humble cardboard container recovered near the entryway in 1995 and its modern counterpart intercepted at the regional airport terminal, was enshrined in forensic literature as a symbol of human resolve. Younger detectives joining the cold case unit were brought to the precinct's training facility to study the Vance file not merely as a masterclass in touch DNA extraction and microvariant genomic sequencing, but as an irreplaceable lesson in ethical perseverance. They were taught that an evidence bag is never truly dead as long as there are investigators willing to protect its chain of custody and wait for the future to provide the tools that the present lacks. For Detective Marcus Thorne, the transition into full retirement proved to be an emotional journey of quiet readjustment. Having spent the better part of 30 years tethered to the ghost of Julian Vance, the sudden absence of the case created an unexpected vacuum in his daily routine. The hypervigilance that had defined his career, the late-night rereading of interrogation transcripts, the endless looping through corporate financial audit trails, and the obsessive monitoring of advancements in molecular genetics slowly gave way to a calm, reflective peace. He began writing his memoirs, not for commercial profit or public notoriety, but to record the human stories behind the badge, the quiet moments of despair in dark bullpen corners, the unsung dedication of lab technicians working under blinding halogen lights, and the unwavering belief that truth possesses its own inescapable gravity. Thorne understood that while technology provided the ultimate key to unlocking the vault, it was human empathy and the refusal to forget a victim that kept the key turning in the lock. Meanwhile, within the sterile confines of the maximum security penitentiary, Arthur Vance settled into the unyielding, repetitive rhythm of a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Stripped of the sophisticated persona he had carefully projected during his years of freedom in upstate New York, Arthur was confronted daily by the absolute failure of his grand design. The bitter envy that had consumed his youth, the toxic, festering hatred toward his identical twin brother's wealth, status, and corporate success had yielded nothing but a concrete cell, a narrow steel cot, and the crushing weight of universal condemnation. Every time he caught his reflection in the polished metal mirror mounted above his cell basin, he was forced to stare into the exact biological likeness of the man he had murdered in cold blood. The identical face that he had once viewed as his ultimate biological shield had transformed into his eternal tormentor, an inescapable mirror image ensuring that he could never run from the memory of his fratricidal crime. The broader scientific and legal communities continued to reap the benefits of the groundbreaking precedents established during the trial. International forensic conferences regularly invited Dr. Helen Vance and her team of molecular geneticists to present their findings on low copy number PCR amplification and epigenetic twin differentiation. Cold case units across North America and Europe began auditing their own unresolved homicide vaults, re-examining historic biological samples through the lens of microvariant sequencing. Old files once deemed permanently cold due to identical twin suspects or degraded touch DNA were reopened, offering newfound hope to thousands of grieving families who had long assumed that justice was beyond their reach. The Vance case became a beacon of redemptive light in the world of criminal jurisprudence, proving that the boundary between an unsolvable cold case and an absolute conviction is often just a matter of time, patience, and scientific courage. As the sun sets over the Lake Ontario shoreline, casting a golden, amber glow across the soaring skyline of downtown Toronto, the narrative arc of the Julian Vance homicide reaches its true, peaceful horizon. The city moves forward, its streets bustling with life, its financial district humming with the tireless energy of a new generation, yet the lessons of November 1995 remain deeply embedded in its cultural soil. Justice was delayed for nearly 3 decades, but it was never ultimately denied. The story of the discarded coffee cup and the identical twins stands as an enduring, timeless parable for the modern age, a testament to the fact that no matter how deep a lie is buried, no matter how clever the murderer, and no matter how long the shadows endure, the truth will always find a way to break through the dark and step boldly into the light. The 15th and ultimate overarching movement of this cinematic true crime epic expands the narrative perspective into a sweeping, contemplative coda, examining the philosophical permanence of truth and the eternal quiet that settles over a city once justice has fully run its course. As the years continue their steady accumulation, embedding the Julian Vance case deep into the historical bedrock of Toronto, the frantic energy of the initial media storm, the high-stakes legal battles of the Ontario Superior Court, and the tense operational theater of the airport surveillance sweep have all receded into memory, replaced by a profound, enduring stillness. The 32nd floor executive office tower, where corporate life moves forward with relentless, unstoppable momentum, bears no physical markers or commemorative plaques to remind the bustling analysts of the violent tragedy that once unfolded upon its carpeted floors. Yet, the absence of a visible monument does not signify erasure. Rather, it highlights how deeply the lessons of the case have become woven into the collective consciousness of the city's legal, forensic, and civic institutions. For retired Detective Marcus Thorne, the passage of time has brought a deep, unshakable sense of completion. Now living a quiet, unhurried existence far from the blinding lights and chaotic sirens of downtown Toronto, Thorne spends his peaceful afternoons tending to a modest garden and reflecting upon the extraordinary arc of his professional life. He no longer carries the crushing, suffocating weight of the unsolved Vance file in his coat pocket, but the memories of those grueling decades remain etched into his soul with indelible clarity. He frequently thinks back to the dark, claustrophobic archive vaults where the physical evidence boxes rested for nearly 30 years, preserving a tiny paper coffee cup like a fragile time capsule waiting to be opened by the future. In his quiet moments of reflection, Thorne often marvels at the strange, beautiful symmetry of human destiny, how a humble, disposable piece of trash discarded on a freezing November dawn in 1995 could cross paths decades later with an identical coffee cup dropped in a bustling airport terminal, creating an unbroken chain of empirical logic that finally dismantled an otherwise impenetrable wall of identical twin immunity. The academic and scientific shockwaves generated by the trial continue to reverberate across international borders, establishing a permanent benchmark for how modern criminal investigations handle cold cases involving identical genetics. Universities and forensic training academies worldwide now feature specialized seminars dedicated to the Vance precedent, teaching the next generation of molecular biologists, detectives, and prosecutors how next-generation sequencing, microvariant profiling, and touch DNA extraction can successfully parse the subtle somatic mutations and epigenetic variations that separate identical twins. The legal textbooks of the 21st century cite Justice Robert Sterling's landmark pretrial rulings regarding public property abandonment and privacy expectations under constitutional law as a masterclass in balancing civil liberties with the unyielding pursuit of scientific truth. Dr. Helen Vance and her team of forensic geneticists are frequently invited to keynote international symposia, where they recount the meticulous chain of custody protocols that ensured the touch DNA extracted from the historic paper coffee cup remained legally unassailable from the laboratory bench all the way to the courtroom witness stand. Yet, beyond the high-tech precision of genomic sequencing and the rigorous frameworks of jurisprudence, the enduring soul of this narrative remains anchored in the sacred duty of remembrance for Julian Vance. Julian was never merely a statistical data point, an administrative cold case number, or a convenient vehicle for legal debate. He was a brilliant, ambitious young man whose vibrant life, intellectual promise, and human potential were violently extinguished in the absolute prime of his years. The horrific betrayal he endured, executed by the one human being on Earth who shared his exact biological face, turning the miraculous mirror of twinship into an instrument of fratricidal malice, will forever stand as one of the darkest, most harrowing chapters in the annals of criminal history. For nearly 3 decades, his voice was effectively silenced, locked away behind the impenetrable wall of scientific limitations and the arrogant confidence of a killer who believed his crime was safely buried beneath the dust of elapsed time. But history, in its own deliberate, unyielding, and majestic way, eventually reclaimed what belonged to the light, proving once and for all that truth is not a fragile human construct, but a living, breathing force waiting patiently in the dark. As the final shadows lengthen across the Canadian landscape, stretching from the cold, sterile concrete walls of the maximum security penitentiary where Arthur Vance spends his remaining days isolated in eternal silence, all the way to the peaceful municipal cemetery where Julian Vance rests beneath the quiet earth, the grand narrative circle is finally and perfectly closed. Arthur is left entirely alone with the deafening emptiness of his choices, a prisoner of his own immutable biology and the inescapable reality that every lie, no matter how carefully constructed or how long protected, eventually collapses under the weight of an unyielding dawn. Meanwhile, the memory of Julian Vance endures, not as a monument to tragedy, but as a radiant, eternal testament to the indomitable power of human persistence, the quiet heroism of investigators who never surrendered, and the miraculous, redemptive awakening of a science that learned to read the invisible signatures of our shared existence. The ghost of the 32nd floor office has finally found its rest, leaving behind a timeless, haunting truth that will echo down through the ages, that justice, though it may sleep for decades, is a living force waiting patiently in the dark, ready to break through the silence whenever the world summons the courage to seek the light. The 16th and final culminating movement of this sweeping true crime narrative steps beyond the immediate horizon of the Julian Vance case to contemplate the timeless, philosophical legacy of truth, memory, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. As the decades continue to unfold, carrying the city of Toronto ever further into the 21st century, the narrative of the 1995 cold case has transcended its origins as a local tragedy of corporate corruption and fraternal betrayal, cementing itself as an indelible touchstone in the global history of criminal justice. The gleaming glass towers of the financial district continue to mirror the shifting Canadian sky, standing as monuments to human ambition and commercial enterprise, yet beneath their polished concrete foundations, the city carries the quiet, sacred resonance of a case that fundamentally redefined what is possible when science, courage, and relentless dedication refuse to yield to the dark. For retired Detective Marcus Thorne, the passing years have brought a profound, settled peace, a quiet tranquility born from the knowledge that his life's work achieved its ultimate, transcendent purpose. Though his badge is long since retired and his days are spent watching the changing seasons from the porch of his suburban home, Thorne remains eternally tethered to the legacy of the file that defined his professional existence. He often thinks back to those endless nights in the 1995 homicide bullpen, staring blankly at the cold, unyielding wall of identical twin immunity and the silent, mocking stillness of the evidence boxes. The journey from that paralyzing despair to the triumphant courtroom verdict stands as a living testament to the miraculous arc of human ingenuity. Thorne's legacy is etched not in monuments of stone or bronze, but in the unyielding standard of professional tenacity he passed down to a new generation of investigators, a standard built on the unbreakable conviction that no human life is ever truly disposable and no mystery is ever permanently beyond the reach of human courage. The ripples of the trial's precedent continue to reverberate across global scientific academies, medical research laboratories, and international law enforcement symposia, ensuring that the lessons learned from Julian and Arthur Vance will protect future generations. Forensic genomics departments across the world now incorporate the landmark microvariant protocols and touch DNA extraction methodologies pioneered in the Toronto cold case into their standard academic curricula, training the upcoming vanguard of criminal investigators to view seemingly worthless environmental debris through an entirely new lens. The humble paper coffee cup, once the ultimate symbol of forensic helplessness in the mid-1990s, has been permanently elevated to the pantheon of forensic legend, a humble household object transformed by science into an instrument of absolute truth. Legal scholars and constitutional courts continue to debate and refine the parameters of public property abandonment and privacy expectations based on Justice Robert Sterling's historic rulings, ensuring that the legal framework of modern jurisprudence evolves hand in hand with the breathtaking advancements of molecular biology. Yet, as the